I had been planning that camping trip for a few weeks, thinking it would be a good break from the noise and rush of the city. I had been working long hours, my head always buried in screens and deadlines, and the thought of being somewhere quiet with only the sound of the wind in the trees felt like the only thing I wanted. I chose a forested area near an old lake, about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a public campground with marked sites and people around. It was just a patch of wilderness that a friend had once told me about. He said not many people went there anymore because of stories about it. I didn't think much of that. People tell stories about every dark place, and they usually involve some ghost or strange thing to make themselves feel braver for having been there. I set out on a Friday morning in late September. The air was already cooler than it had been a week before, and the leaves had just started to turn. My car was loaded with my tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food for 2 nights, a flashlight, and some basic gear. The drive was easy for the first 2 hours. Once I got off the main road, the pavement gave way to cracked asphalt and then to a narrow dirt path lined with pine and birch trees. I followed it for several miles, watching as the forest grew thicker, the light filtering through the branches in sharp slants. There were no signs, no other cars, no sound except the crunch of my tires on gravel. When I reached a spot that looked flat and dry, about 100 feet from the lake's edge, I parked. The lake was calm and almost black, reflecting the sky and trees in a way that made it look like a sheet of dark glass. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. I unpacked my things, set up my tent, and made sure my sleeping bag was unrolled inside. I gathered some dry wood for later, thinking about how quiet it was. Even in the middle of nowhere, you usually hear birds or the distant hum of something mechanical. Here, it was just stillness, with only the occasional faint rustle of leaves when the wind moved. By late afternoon, I had eaten and was sitting by the shore, watching the water. It was the kind of quiet that made you more aware of small sounds. A branch snapping somewhere far off, the faint splash of something in the lake, the sound of your own breath. I stayed out there until the light started to fade. Then I lit a small fire near the tent. The glow felt warm against the creeping chill. I had extra firewood stacked beside me and the flashlight ready in case I needed to go into the trees for anything. It was after dark that I noticed it for the first time. A sound, faint at first, somewhere to my left, in the direction where the trees were thicker and the slope led up into a ridge. It wasn't like an animal moving, too steady for that. It was like someone dragging something through the leaves. I turned my head toward it, the firelight not reaching that far, and listened. It stopped. I stayed there, still, letting my eyes adjust to the dark beyond the circle of firelight. After a few minutes, I heard it again, dragging, then a pause, then dragging again. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or an animal moving in a slow, odd way. But the sound wasn't random. It seemed like it came in short bursts, always stopping when I shifted in my seat or leaned forward. I let the fire burn lower and eventually went into the tent, thinking maybe I was just letting the isolation get to me. Inside the tent, lying on my back, I could hear more clearly. The sound was faint but steady at times, then gone completely. I kept telling myself it was nothing unusual. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It was completely dark except for the dim blue glow of the moonlight through the thin fabric of the tent. The fire had long since died. I lay still, listening. That dragging sound was back, but it was closer. I could hear leaves moving, something brushing against the ground, then stopping. My heart started to pound. I reached for the flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it toward the tent wall, seeing only the pale, uneven surface lit up. I unzipped the flap slowly and shined the light outside. Nothing, just the trees, the ground, and the faint shimmer of the lake. I stayed awake for a long time, light in hand, until eventually the sound stopped and I drifted off again. The next morning, I went to check around the area where I thought the sound had come from. About 20 feet from my tent, near the base of a tree, I saw something odd. The dirt and leaves were disturbed in a narrow line, like something had been dragged there. The line wasn't very long, maybe 6 feet, and it ended at the edge of the lake. I crouched down to look closer and saw faint grooves in the dirt, almost like marks from rope or wire. That made me uneasy, but I told myself it could have been anything. a log dragged by water, or maybe some animal pulling something toward the lake. I tried to push it out of my mind and spent the day hiking around the ridge. The forest was dense and uneven, with patches of moss and loose rock. I found some animal tracks, mostly deer, and the remains of a small fire pit that looked old. By the time I got back, the sun was dipping low. I made another fire, cooked, and tried to enjoy the quiet. That night, it happened again. The dragging sound started earlier, just after the last light was gone. This time, it came from a different direction, behind the tent, deeper in the trees. It was still slow and steady, but now it seemed heavier, like whatever was making it was larger or carrying more weight. I sat by the fire, flashlight in my lap, staring into the dark. I thought I saw movement once, a shadow shifting against the background of trees, but when I shined the light there, nothing was moving. I didn't sleep much that night. The sound came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. At one point, I heard it circling, starting behind me, moving toward the lake, then fading. I kept my flashlight on until the batteries started to dim. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave a day early. The dragging sound wasn't something I could explain, and it wasn't something I wanted to keep listening to in the middle of nowhere. I started packing up, but before I took down the tent, I walked toward the area where I had heard it last. The ground there was softer, and I saw more of those drag marks, longer this time, leading toward a spot between two trees. When I stepped closer, I saw what had been making them. A length of old, frayed rope was half buried under leaves and dirt. One end was looped into a rough knot, and the other was worn down to thin threads. It looked like it had been there a long time, maybe years. It must have been caught on something, maybe a fallen branch, and when the wind picked up at night, it dragged across the ground, pulling leaves with it. That explained the start and stop sound. The one near the lake must have been the same thing. Some rope or wire, maybe from an old dock or a fishing net, being moved by the wind. In the dark, with nothing else around, it was easy to imagine something worse. I pulled the rope free and tossed it aside. When I finally left, the lake and trees looked exactly the same as they had when I arrived, calm, still, almost too quiet. I knew there was nothing out there watching me, nothing following me, but the memory of that sound stayed with me the whole drive home. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just the kind of thing your mind builds into something bigger when you're alone in the dark, far from anyone else, and all you have is the sound of something moving when it shouldn't. It was late August when I decided to head out for a weekend alone in the mountains. I had been working non-stop for weeks, sitting in front of a computer until my eyes burned, and I needed to get away from all the noise. I wanted to be somewhere I couldn't hear traffic or phone alerts or the hum of air conditioning. Just quiet. I packed up my small two-person tent, a sleeping bag, my stove, and enough food for 3 days. I didn't want to camp at an established site with picnic tables and bathrooms. I wanted to go somewhere off the trail, far enough from anyone else that I wouldn't see another human being the entire time. The spot I chose was in the foothills of a mountain range about a 3-hour drive from my apartment. I had been there before in the spring, but only for a short hike. The trail was not particularly popular because it was steep and rocky, with no big scenic view at the end, just miles of pine forest, brush, and scattered boulders. That was exactly what I wanted. My plan was to hike in about 5 miles, leave the trail, and set up camp in a flat clearing I remembered passing on my last trip. I left early Friday morning. The weather forecast said it would be warm during the day and cool at night, with no chance of rain. I drove through small towns, past gas stations and shuttered diners, until the road narrowed to a single lane. Eventually, the pavement ended, and I bumped along a gravel Forest Service road for another 20 minutes until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars there. I liked that. I strapped my pack on, tightened the hip belt, and started walking. The trail climbed right away, winding between thick pines. The air smelled sharp and clean. My boots crunched over gravel and pine needles. Occasionally, I stopped to drink water and listen. All I could hear was wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of a bird somewhere high above. It felt good to move, to sweat, to be away from the clutter of daily life. The weight of the pack dug into my shoulders, but it was a good kind of ache. After about 3 hours, I reached the spot I remembered. A small open area just off the trail where the ground was mostly level and covered with soft grass. A few large boulders sat at the edge, and a cluster of tall pines offered shade. It was far enough from the trail that anyone passing by wouldn't see my tent unless they were looking for it. I set my pack down, stretched my back, and began to unpack. The sun was still high, so I had plenty of daylight. I pitched the tent first, making sure the stakes were secure. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and laid out my pad. I set up my small camp stove on a flat rock and boiled water for a simple lunch of instant noodles. As I ate, I looked around and tried to take in every detail. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the rough texture of the boulders, the faint rustle of something moving in the underbrush far away. I thought it might be a rabbit or squirrel. Nothing unusual. After lunch, I decided to explore the area a little. I didn't go too far, just far enough to get a sense of the surroundings. I noticed a narrow animal trail leading deeper into the forest. It wasn't a human-made path, just a gap in the brush where something, probably deer, had moved through many times. The ground there was uneven and soft, with patches of bare dirt. I didn't think much of it and turned back before I lost sight of camp. The first night was calm. I built a small fire in a ring of stones I found nearby and cooked a can of chili. The flames were hypnotic, and the heat felt good as the air cooled. When it got dark, it got very dark. No distant glow of a town, no headlights on a road, just a black wall of trees. I sat by the fire for a while, then climbed into my tent. I lay there listening to the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. Out here, the forest is never truly silent. I drifted off around midnight. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I realized I had heard something. A faint crunch of leaves, then another. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stayed still, listening. Could have been a deer moving through the brush. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, and I fell asleep again. The next morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside into cold, damp air. The grass was wet with dew. I boiled water for coffee and ate oatmeal while the sun slowly climbed above the treetops. I decided I would take a longer walk that day, maybe follow that animal trail I'd seen and see where it went. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a knife, then headed out. The animal trail wound deeper into the forest. The ground was softer here, and I noticed more tracks. Hoof prints from deer, and something else I couldn't identify. The trail eventually led to a small stream, where I sat on a rock and ate a granola bar. The water was clear and cold. I filled my bottle, then followed the stream for a while before looping back toward camp. I was gone for maybe 4 hours total. When I returned, everything at camp looked normal at first. But when I went to the tent, I noticed something odd. The flap was unzipped. I was certain I had zipped it before leaving. My first thought was that I had simply forgotten, but then I noticed the corner of my sleeping bag was pulled up, as if something had been inside. I checked my food bag. It was untouched, hanging from a branch like I had left it. I couldn't figure out why anything would disturb my tent but not take food. I told myself it must have been the wind, even though that didn't make much sense. That night, I couldn't relax the same way I had the first night. I kept glancing into the trees, listening for footsteps. I built the fire bigger than before and sat close to it, watching the shadows jump on the ground. When I finally went to bed, I kept my flashlight in my hand. It was maybe an hour later when I woke up again. This time the sound was much closer, slow, deliberate steps in the grass. Not the quick, darting sound of an animal running, but something moving with care. My heart started pounding. I stayed completely still, breathing through my mouth to stay quiet. The steps came closer, then stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, human breathing, slow and steady. I didn't move. I gripped my flashlight and my knife, every muscle tense. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever, then slowly moved away. I waited another 10 minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to look out. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest was still. Whoever or whatever it was had left. The next morning, I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe even a bear, though the breathing had sounded too soft for that. I stayed one more night. I shouldn't have. That third night, I made a plan. I would stay awake and watch. I kept the fire going and sat with my back against a boulder, my flashlight and knife ready. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just past midnight, I saw movement. Someone standing between the trees, maybe 30 feet away. They weren't holding a light, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out their face, only the outline of a person. I didn't call out. I didn't move. Eventually, they turned and walked back into the darkness without a sound. I stayed awake until dawn. The moment the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag into its sack. I didn't eat breakfast. I just threw the pack on and got back to the trail. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I never found out who it was or why they were there, but I know for certain it wasn't an animal, and I haven't camped alone since. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was to spend 3 nights alone in the woods, far from any marked trail, somewhere quiet where I could clear my head. I had been feeling stuck in my routine lately, and camping had always been the one thing that helped me reset. I picked a national forest about 4 hours from home, an area I had never explored before. From the maps I studied, there were thick patches of pine and spruce, rolling hills, and small creeks that cut through the valleys. There were also stretches of old logging roads, most of them abandoned, which meant I could hike in without bumping into other people. I didn't want to see anyone out there. The morning I left, the air was warm but overcast. I packed everything the night before. My tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 4 days, a small axe, water filter, extra clothes, and my old hunting knife that had been with me for years. I checked my pack twice to make sure nothing was missing. I also brought a first aid kit and a small flashlight with extra batteries. By noon, I had reached the forest. I parked my car on the side of a gravel road that hadn't seen much traffic, judging by the grass growing between the tire ruts. From there, I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking in. At first, the path was easy, wide enough for a vehicle, the ground hard and flat. But after about 40 minutes, I turned off onto a faint trail that cut deeper into the trees. The canopy thickened quickly, swallowing the sound of the wind, and I felt that shift in the air that happens when you're far from any sign of human life. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing just big enough for my tent. It sat next to a narrow stream, the water running clear over smooth stones. The ground was mostly level, covered in pine needles, and there were no big ant hills or exposed roots. I set my pack down and stood there for a while, just listening. All I heard was the water and the occasional creak of trees. No cars, no voices, exactly what I wanted. I pitched the tent and laid out my sleeping bag inside. I collected dead branches and small sticks from the ground and built a fire pit with a ring of rocks I found nearby. By the time the fire was going, the light had begun to fade into that pale, grayish blue that comes before night. I made a simple dinner, boiled pasta with a packet of tuna, and ate while sitting on a log. I remember feeling content, even a little proud of myself for finding such a peaceful spot. That first night, I slept well. The air cooled down, and the steady sound of the stream was like white noise. I woke up once or twice, hearing small rustles in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just squirrels or raccoons. The next day, I decided to explore farther up the stream. I left my pack behind, carrying only a water bottle and my knife. The stream wound through thickets and fallen logs, forcing me to hop over rocks and push through low branches. After maybe an hour, I noticed a faint smell, something sharp and unpleasant, carried by the breeze. I thought it might be a dead animal somewhere nearby. As I moved closer, the smell grew stronger. Then I saw it. A deer carcass lying half in the water, its ribcage torn open. The flesh picked clean in some places but still ragged in others. Flies swarmed thick around it. The kill didn't look old. The blood in the water was still faintly red. My first thought was coyotes, but the tearing looked rougher, and the legs were twisted in a way that didn't seem like the work of smaller animals. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, before deciding to head back to camp. On the way, I kept glancing behind me. The forest felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. Every crack of a branch made my shoulders tense. When I reached camp, I added more wood to the fire and sat close to it, telling myself I was being paranoid. Still, I kept my knife within reach all afternoon. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving in the brush on the far side of the stream. It was slow, deliberate, not the quick, light scurrying of a raccoon. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The movement stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. The fire had burned down to embers, and I didn't want to unzip the tent and draw attention. I lay there for what felt like an hour, heart pounding, until eventually the sound faded away. In the morning, I found fresh tracks in the damp soil near the stream. They were larger than a dog's, with deep claw marks. I knew they were bear tracks, but something about them felt off. The stride seemed uneven, like whatever it was had been moving slowly, almost dragging its feet. I thought about packing up and leaving then, but the sun was out, and in daylight the fear felt foolish. I convinced myself I could handle it if I stayed alert. The third day was warm, and I decided to stay close to camp. I gathered more wood, filtered water, and kept the fire going brighter than usual. In the afternoon, I heard something from deeper in the woods. A low, rhythmic thud, like heavy steps, came and went, never close enough to see the source. By sunset, I was on edge again. I cooked quickly, ate, and made sure the fire was big enough to throw light into the surrounding trees. The forest was unusually quiet that night. No insects, no distant calls of owls. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, the sound was not across the stream. It was right outside my tent. I could hear slow breathing, deep and steady. Then something brushed against the fabric, making it ripple slightly. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tight my hand hurt. The thing outside stayed there for what felt like forever. I could hear faint shifting, the sound of weight moving on the ground. Then it circled the tent once, slow and deliberate. When it reached the side near my head, it stopped again. I thought about lunging out with the knife, but fear kept me still. Eventually, after a long silence, I heard the steps retreat into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could. I doused the fire, slung on my pack, and started back the way I'd come. My pace was quick, almost a jog, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt heavier, the air thicker. About halfway back, I saw movement ahead on the trail. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but then it stepped into clearer view and my stomach dropped. It was a black bear, big, its fur matted and patchy, one of its ears torn. It wasn't charging, but it wasn't moving away either. It just stood there, head low, eyes fixed on me. I slowly backed up, keeping my pack between us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After a long standoff, the bear finally turned and moved off into the trees, but I could still hear it moving parallel to the trail as I walked. It followed me for nearly half a mile, always just far enough away that I couldn't see it unless I stopped and listened. When I finally reached the gravel road, I didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I drove until I hit the main highway before I let myself breathe normally again. Even now, I don't know if the bear had been watching me from the first day, or if it just stumbled onto my camp by chance. But I know this: I won't be camping alone that deep in the woods again. Some places are peaceful until they decide you don't belong there. The trip had been planned for months. I wanted something quiet, far from people, somewhere I could camp without hearing the distant sound of cars or seeing the glow of city lights at night. I studied maps for days and found a spot deep in a national forest, far past the usual campsites where most people stop. There were no marked trails that went all the way there, but I had a GPS, a compass, and a pack full of gear. I left my car parked at a dirt pull-off on a narrow service road, locked it, and stepped into the tree line just after sunrise. The first miles were easy. The air was still cool, with that damp, earthy smell you only get in the woods early in the day. The light came through the trees in thin shafts, catching on spider webs strung between branches. My pack felt heavy at first, but I settled into a rhythm, following a faint deer path most of the way. Every so often, I'd stop to check my position on the GPS, making sure I was still moving toward the small clearing I'd chosen on the map. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No distant hum of highways, no voices. Just wind moving through leaves and the occasional rustle of something small moving in the underbrush. By midday, I'd covered nearly 8 miles. I stopped near a shallow stream to fill my water bottles and eat. The stream gurgled over small stones, and the water was so cold that it made my fingers ache when I dipped them in. I sat on a fallen log, chewing slowly, watching a dragonfly hover over the water. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. I reached the clearing in the late afternoon. It wasn't much, just a patch of ground where the trees opened up enough to let sunlight in. The grass was knee-high in places, and the earth beneath was soft with layers of fallen leaves. I picked a spot near the edge, where I could see the trees but still have open sky above me. Setting up camp took about an hour. I pitched my tent, staked it tight, rolled out my sleeping bag inside, and built a small fire ring from stones I collected nearby. The wood I gathered was dry and light, and soon I had a small fire going, more for comfort than warmth. The sun went down quickly in the forest. One moment the clearing was bathed in golden light, and the next it was fading into shadow. The trees seemed to grow taller and closer in the dimming light. I sat by the fire, eating from a metal pot, the smoke curling upward into the dark. Crickets started their steady chorus, and somewhere far off, I heard the low hoot of an owl. It was exactly the solitude I'd wanted. But as night deepened, I began to notice small sounds. Not the random noises of the forest settling, but heavier steps, far off at first, then closer. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was probably deer moving through. Still, the sound carried differently, measured, deliberate, not the erratic rustle of an animal grazing. It faded after a while, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I banked the fire to embers and climbed into my tent. Inside, the fabric walls felt paper-thin. I could hear every crack of a twig, every shift of leaves. Lying there, I tried to listen for patterns, anything that might suggest a large animal was nearby. Eventually, I must have dozed off. A sharp sound woke me, a branch snapping somewhere in the dark. My eyes opened, but inside the tent it was pitch black. The fire had burned down completely, leaving only faint warmth in the air. I lay perfectly still, my ears straining. Another step. This one was closer. Then nothing. The silence stretched so long that I began to wonder if I'd imagined it. Slowly, I unzipped the tent door just enough to peer outside. The clearing was black and silver under the moonlight. The grass moved slightly in the breeze, and the trees stood like dark walls on every side. I saw no movement, but something about the stillness felt wrong. Usually, even at night, there are small movements. Moths fluttering near the embers, a mouse darting through the grass. Now, there was nothing. I listened for several long minutes before pulling the zipper closed again. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept waking, sometimes to nothing, sometimes to faint noises I couldn't identify. By the time the first pale light appeared, I was relieved to crawl out of the tent. The air was cold, and the grass was wet with dew. I built the fire back up and heated water for coffee, trying to shake off the unease from the night. I decided to stay one more night before heading back. The morning passed easily. I explored the area, found another small stream, and took photos of moss-covered rocks and twisted old trees. But I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps. It sat in the back of my mind, heavy and unwelcome. By evening, clouds had rolled in, making the light fade earlier than the night before. I built the fire higher, the flicker casting moving shadows across the clearing. I kept glancing toward the treeline. Every shape seemed suspicious. The curve of a branch, the darkness between trunks. I ate quickly, then sat watching the fire, forcing myself to stay awake longer. When I finally lay down, I kept my flashlight in my hand. I must have drifted into a shallow sleep, because the next thing I knew, I was aware of movement again. This time it was closer, circling the clearing. Slow, steady steps. Grass rustled lightly. My heartbeat was so loud it felt like it was in my ears. I thought about unzipping the tent, shining the light outside, but part of me didn't want to see. The sound stopped, then started again, this time on the other side. I stayed frozen, gripping the flashlight until my fingers hurt. Eventually, the steps faded into the distance. The next morning, I found the grass trampled in several places just beyond the trees. Not in random patches like deer trails, but in a wide arc around my camp. The prints were vague in the soft ground, but some were longer than my boot and narrow. Not bear, not deer, something else. I didn't stick around to think about it. I packed quickly, doused the fire, and started the hike back. Every mile I felt watched. I kept glancing behind me, scanning the trees. Several times I heard movement, but I didn't stop to look. My only focus was reaching the road, reaching my car. By the time I stepped out of the forest and saw the dull green of the vehicle, my legs felt shaky. I threw my pack in the back and got in. Before starting the engine, I sat for a long moment, looking at the tree line. The forest was still, the shadows deep. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something had been there, moving just out of sight, watching from the dark. And I knew I'd never come back to that place again. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. It wasn't anything special. No mountain summits or long hikes through national parks. Just a few days out in the woods to get away from everything. My job had been running me into the ground lately, and I could feel the stress piling up in my chest like wet sand. I needed the quiet, the space, the slow rhythm of being somewhere that didn't care about deadlines or emails. The place I picked wasn't far from home, about an hour's drive, and it wasn't a popular spot either. It was tucked between a stretch of farmland and a river that bent sharply into a deep, wooded section. I'd been there once before with a friend years back, but we never stayed overnight. I remembered the place as peaceful, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy in your ears. That's exactly what I wanted now. I left in the late morning so I could set up camp with daylight to spare. The sky was a pale blue, no clouds in sight, and the air was warm but not stifling. Felt like a good start. My car was loaded with everything I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, food, a folding chair, and a small cooler with drinks. I had a cheap hatchet, a flashlight, a few extra batteries, and my phone, though I already knew the reception would be spotty out there. The road leading to the site was narrow, with grass growing over the edges, and at some points the trees leaned in so close their branches almost touched above. The last half mile was just dirt and scattered rocks. My car bumped along slowly, dust kicking up behind me. I pulled into a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly toward the river. I got out, stretched, and listened. There was nothing but the faint rush of water in the distance and the occasional buzz of an insect. No cars, no voices, no signs of other people. Perfect. The clearing had just enough space for the tent and a small fire pit someone had left behind. A simple ring of rocks with blackened ash in the middle. Beyond the clearing, the trees thickened quickly, the trunks close together, their branches creating a patchy roof of leaves that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground. I set up the tent first. The soil was soft enough for the stakes to go in easily, and soon I had it standing with its rainfly secured. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and tossed in my pillow. Then I set the cooler under a small tarp to keep it shaded and laid my folding chair near the fire pit. By the time I finished, the sun was higher and the air was warm enough to make me thirsty. I grabbed a drink from the cooler and walked down toward the river. The water moved lazily here, but it was deep enough to be dark and reflective. A few dragonflies skimmed the surface, and the far bank was lined with more trees, their roots snaking down into the soil like frozen veins. I followed the bank a little just to stretch my legs. The mud was damp but not slippery. I saw a few sets of animal tracks, some small and bird-like, others that looked like raccoon prints. A larger set caught my attention for a moment, but they were old, the edges crumbling, and I couldn't tell exactly what had made them. After a while, I headed back to the clearing. I spent the afternoon gathering some firewood from the edge of the woods. The fallen branches were dry enough to snap easily, but I still kept the hatchet handy for thicker pieces. I stacked the wood near the fire pit and sat down in my chair, just listening. That's when I noticed it, the quiet. It had been quiet when I arrived, sure, but now it felt different. Earlier there had been bird calls here and there, the faint rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. Now there was nothing but the occasional hiss of the river. No wind, no movement, no sound of life. I shook it off. Animals go still sometimes. Maybe there was a hawk nearby or something that spooked them. Still, I found myself looking into the trees more than before, scanning between the trunks. The rest of the evening went normally enough. I lit the fire as the sun began to drop, cooking a simple meal over the flames. The smell of smoke drifted into my clothes, and the heat was welcome as the air cooled. Darkness came slowly, the last streaks of sunlight fading behind the trees. I had my flashlight, but I kept the fire going strong, feeding it until the wood pile was half gone. Out here, the dark was different. It wasn't like in the city, where streetlights and house windows kept the night at bay. Here, once the firelight ended, the darkness was total. I was sitting in my chair, staring at the flames, when I thought I heard something behind me. A faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze, my ears straining. The fire popped loudly, masking smaller noises. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through maybe 20 feet before it was swallowed by black. Nothing moved. I waited a long moment scanning before turning back to the fire. But now my senses were sharper. Every crackle, every shift in the shadows, made me glance over my shoulder. I told myself it was just the woods settling, maybe a branch falling somewhere unseen. When I finally decided to sleep, I made sure the fire was low but still burning. I zipped the tent up tight, laid down in my sleeping bag, and tried to relax. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. It was deep into the night. The air was cold, and my breath felt heavy in the tent. And I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking them. Slow, deliberate steps moving just outside the tent. They crunched on the leaves, paused, then shifted again. I lay completely still, every muscle locked. My heart thudded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps moved past the tent, toward the river, then stopped. I waited, straining to hear, but the silence returned. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, but eventually I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning light made everything feel less threatening. I unzipped the tent, half expecting to see footprints in the dirt, but there was nothing clear, just a scattering of leaves and soft soil that didn't hold shape. Still, the unease stayed with me. I decided to keep the day busy. I walked further upriver, explored a few fallen trees, and even tried fishing for a while, though I caught nothing. I kept glancing back toward camp, never fully relaxing. By late afternoon, the sky had grown hazy, the sunlight dull. I had collected more firewood, but I found myself wondering if I should just pack up and leave. The thought of another night with those footsteps made my stomach knot. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it had been an animal moving slow enough to sound like a person. I come here to get away, and leaving early would feel like giving up over nothing. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, its glow casting long shadows into the woods. The noises returned just past midnight. Not constant, just enough to let me know something was out there. When I finally saw it, it wasn't what I expected. Through a gap in the trees, maybe 30 feet from the firelight, I caught the outline of a man. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still. His clothes blended with the darkness, but his face caught the faintest glint of light. He didn't move, neither did I. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Finally, without a sound, he stepped back into the blackness and was gone. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, my decision was made. I packed quickly, my hands trembling. I kept scanning the treeline, half expecting him to appear again. The drive out felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might be hiding him. I didn't breathe easy until I was back on the main road, the woods shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to that place, and I don't think I ever will. I had been planning the trip for months, telling myself I needed a break from the noise of the city and the endless stream of small but exhausting problems that filled my life. I picked a remote national forest that I had only read about online, a place where the trails weren't well marked and the nearest town was about 30 miles away. I wanted the kind of silence you could only find far from roads, far from houses, far from other people. It took me almost 7 hours of driving before I reached the gravel road that cut into the forest. The sun was already leaning toward the west, throwing long shadows across the dusty track. My car jolted and rattled over potholes, and every so often the trees closed in so tightly on both sides that my side mirrors nearly brushed against them. I had a printed map, but the road twisted and forked in ways it didn't show, so I kept having to guess which direction was right. By the time I reached the small pull-off I had picked from satellite images, it was past 5 in the evening. My plan was to hike for about an hour, find a clearing near the creek I'd seen on the map, and set up my tent before dark. I stuffed my backpack with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food, water filter, and a headlamp. My phone had lost service more than an hour earlier. I wasn't worried. I told myself that was the whole point. The trail started off faint but easy to follow. Fallen leaves muffled my footsteps, and the air smelled sharp and clean, carrying the damp scent of moss and cold earth. The deeper I walked, the quieter it became. Even the breeze seemed to die down, and soon the only sounds were the creak of my backpack straps and the crunch of my boots. After about 40 minutes, I reached the creek. It wasn't much wider than a car, but the water was clear, running fast over smooth stones. I found a small flat patch of grass about 20 yards from the bank, ringed by tall spruce and fir trees. Felt private, shielded from sight. I set my pack down and stood there for a moment, listening to the steady rush of water. I remember thinking it was perfect. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven, and I had to clear away sticks and small rocks before I could pitch the tent. By the time I finished, the light had shifted into that dim, blue-gray shade that comes right before dusk. I boiled some water for instant noodles, sitting on a rock as steam curled into the cooling air. I ate quickly, more aware of the dark closing in with every passing minute. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, it was fully dark outside. The tent walls fluttered slightly in a faint breeze, but otherwise the night was still. I lay there, staring up at the nylon ceiling, my mind slowly emptying of the day's noise. I must have drifted in and out of light sleep for an hour or two. At some point, a sound pulled me back to full awareness. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate crunch, like a foot pressing down on dry leaves. Then another, spaced out, slow. My first thought was that it might be a deer. I stayed still, listening. The steps continued, maybe 20 feet away, moving in a half circle around my tent. I could hear them on the thin layer of debris over the soil, the sound faint but distinct in the stillness. I told myself it was an animal, maybe even a raccoon. But then there was the pause, too long, too careful. An animal wouldn't stop like that unless it sensed danger. The air in the tent felt warmer all of a sudden, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I reached quietly for the small folding knife I kept near the door. My hand found the handle, but I didn't unzip the tent. Instead, I lay there, frozen, every muscle tight. After a few minutes, the sound faded into the distance. I waited longer, maybe 20 minutes, before I let my body relax again. Eventually, sleep came in short, restless bursts. When I woke, it was early morning, pale light filtering through the tent fabric. I stepped outside, half expecting to see tracks in the dirt. There were marks, but they were messy, just scattered patches where leaves had been disturbed. They could have been from me walking around the night before, or they could have been from something else. I shook off the thought and decided to explore upstream after breakfast. I packed a small bag with snacks, water, and my map, leaving the tent and most of my gear behind. The creek wound through narrow banks, the forest on either side dense with undergrowth. I climbed over fallen logs and ducked under low branches, keeping close to the water so I wouldn't lose my bearings. Every so often, I'd stop and just listen. The forest was quiet in that heavy, almost oppressive way that made every small sound seem louder. About an hour in, I came across a patch where the creek widened into a shallow pool. The ground nearby was soft and muddy. That's when I saw them, prints. Not animal prints. Not deer, not bear. These were boot prints. They were faint, but the shape was clear enough. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was different, and they were larger. They led away from the creek, up into the trees. I stood there for a while, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't a well-traveled area. There were no marked campsites, no nearby roads. Whoever it was, they had been moving along the creek just like I was now. I told myself it was probably a hiker passing through, but the prints looked fresh, edges still sharp, not softened by wind or rain, and there was only one set, leading away, not toward the water. I decided to turn back. As I walked downstream, I kept looking over my shoulder. When I reached my campsite, nothing seemed disturbed. My tent was still zipped, my gear untouched. I boiled water for coffee, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept scanning the trees, the shadows between them seeming deeper than before. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, dimming the light even earlier than the night before. I decided to build a small fire, partly for warmth, partly for the comfort of light. I gathered dry sticks and kindling, crouched beside the flames as they took hold. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they came from the opposite side of the creek. Slow, deliberate, moving through the brush. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was too heavy for an animal that size. I froze, listening, my eyes locked on the dark tangle of trees. The steps stopped. The hair on my arms prickled. I stood slowly, my heart pounding, scanning for movement. Nothing, just the quiet rush of water. After a long minute, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my knife again, slipping it into my pocket. I didn't want to show panic, even though I was alone and no one could see me. I kept the fire going until it was fully dark, then let it burn low before crawling into my tent. I didn't sleep much. Every rustle of leaves, every faint crack of a branch felt like it was right outside the thin nylon wall. At some point, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, circling. I held my breath, gripping the knife until my hand ached. The sound lingered for a few minutes, then faded. When morning came, I made the decision to leave. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack without much care for neatness. I wanted to be moving. The hike back felt longer than it had the first day. Every sound behind me made me glance over my shoulder. Twice, I thought I saw movement far back along the trail, but when I stopped, the forest was still. When I reached my car, the relief was almost physical. I tossed my pack into the back seat, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute, staring at the empty road ahead. I told myself I'd come back someday, maybe with friends, maybe to finish the trip I'd planned. But I knew even then that I wouldn't. Something about that place was wrong. Not in a way you could explain, but in the way your instincts screamed at you when you were in danger. I started the engine and drove away, watching the trees thin out in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, and even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking along the side of the road. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. It was the kind of thing I told myself I needed, a break from work, from screens, from the constant noise of other people. I picked a remote spot in the mountains, several miles from the nearest road. I wanted to be away from everything, somewhere I could just sit by a fire at night and listen to the wind in the trees. The trail into the area was long and uneven. My backpack felt heavier than it should have been, and by the time I reached the clearing I had chosen on the map, I was drenched in sweat. The air smelled clean and sharp, and there was a faint scent of pine sap hanging in it. The clearing was surrounded by tall evergreens, their branches swaying slightly even though there wasn't much wind down here. The ground was covered with needles and small twigs that crunched under my boots. I set my pack down and just stood there for a few minutes, breathing and listening. There was no sound of cars, no voices, nothing but the faint rustle of the forest. Somewhere far off, I could hear the trickle of water. I pitched my small tent near the edge of the clearing where the ground was flat. I gathered wood for the fire before it got too dark, making a small pile of dry sticks and thicker logs. I could see faint animal tracks in the dirt, but they looked old, maybe from deer or raccoons. By late afternoon, I had a fire going. I cooked a simple meal and ate while watching the sunlight fade between the tree trunks. The forest seemed to grow darker faster than the open areas I was used to. Shadows stretched across the clearing, and the orange light from the fire seemed to push back at them just a little. The first night was quiet. I woke up a few times to the sounds of branches snapping somewhere in the distance, but nothing came close. I told myself it was just small animals moving around. The second day, I decided to hike to the creek I'd heard the day before. It was about a half-mile away, winding through a narrow valley. The water was cold and clear, and I filled my bottles there. I also noticed more tracks in the damp earth along the bank, larger ones this time. They were broad, with deep impressions where claws had sunk into the mud. I paused for a while, looking at them. They were fresh. I didn't like that. I knew bears were common in these mountains, but the idea of one wandering near my camp wasn't something I had really prepared for beyond reading the usual safety tips. I had food sealed in bags and stored away from the tent, but still, the thought stuck with me. Back at camp, I kept glancing at the trees. Every sound in the undergrowth seemed louder than before. I built the fire bigger that night, as if the extra light would somehow make the forest safer. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke to a sound that was much closer than before. A heavy, slow movement, like something large brushing against the low branches. My breathing slowed without me meaning to. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the inside of the tent was nearly pitch black. The sound came again, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. I could hear the rhythm of its steps, heavy, measured. I lay there perfectly still, straining to make out how close it was. Then I heard the sound of something sniffing, a deep, wet exhale, followed by the faint scrape of claws on dirt. My mouth went dry. I had left my backpack against a tree on the far side of the clearing, away from the tent, thinking that would keep any animals interested in the smell from bothering me. Now I wasn't sure if that had been enough. The sniffing moved closer to where the fire pit was. I could hear a low huffing sound, and then the distinct noise of something nudging at my metal cooking pot. Clanged softly. The bear was in my camp. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. Every instinct I had screamed at me to make noise, to scare it off, but I remembered reading that startling a bear at close range could make things worse. I kept my hands still on my sleeping bag, listening to it move. The sound of its paws on the dirt was slow, deliberate. I could hear its weight shift as it stepped, the ground giving a soft crunch under it. It moved toward the far side of camp, and for a moment I thought maybe it would just leave. Then I heard it stop. The sniffing came again, but this time closer to the tent. I froze. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears it felt like the animal had to hear it. The steps came nearer. The sound of its breathing was heavier now, more curious. I imagined it standing just outside, head tilted, trying to figure out what was inside the thin nylon. Something brushed against the side of the tent, lightly at first, then with more pressure. The wall bowed inward slightly. I could smell it now, a musky, earthy scent, like wet soil mixed with animal fur. The air inside the tent felt thin. It lingered for what felt like forever, then pulled away. I heard it moving toward the food bag I had hung between two trees. There was a tearing sound, then the faint thump of something hitting the ground. It was eating. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every small sound magnified in the dark. When the first pale light began to seep through the tent fabric, I unzipped it slowly and looked out. The bag was shredded. The ground around it was churned up with large paw prints. I decided then that I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the tree line. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. I kept thinking about how quiet it had been right before it appeared, how easily it had moved into camp without me knowing until it was already there. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. My shoulders ached from the pack, and my legs felt heavy, but I didn't stop. I only breathed easier when I saw the faint outline of the road through the trees. When I finally reached my car, I set the pack in the trunk and just stood there for a while, listening. The forest was still behind me, the same as it had been before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching the whole time. I had gone out there looking for quiet, for peace, and I had found it, but it wasn't the kind I had imagined. It was the kind that comes before something steps out of the trees. I drove away without looking back. The mountains were still there in the rearview mirror, green and calm under the sun, but I knew what had walked through them in the dark, and I knew I wouldn't be camping alone out there again. It was late September when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone. The leaves had just begun to change, and the forest had that dry, brittle smell from fallen leaves mixing with the damp, earthy scent that always lingers after a cool night. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, and a small camping stove. I wanted something quiet, away from people, away from the noise of town. I chose a spot I'd never been to before, a clearing I'd seen on a topographic map, about 3 miles from the nearest marked trail. It wasn't an official campsite, but that was the point. I wanted isolation. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky was cloudless, a pale blue fading into a deeper shade as the day went on. I reached the clearing just before sunset. The place was almost perfect. A soft bed of pine needles underfoot, trees surrounding me in all directions, and a small creek about 50 yards away. I set up my tent facing the creek, figuring the sound of running water would be good background noise for sleeping. After unpacking, I built a small fire with fallen branches. I cooked a simple meal, sitting cross-legged on the ground, letting the warmth of the flames soak into my legs. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through leaves. I could hear the distant knock of a woodpecker and the high-pitched call of some bird I didn't recognize. The first odd thing happened around dusk. I was sitting near the fire, watching the sky turn orange, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. It was subtle, like someone walking between trees far off to my right. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just still gray trunks and shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a branch swaying in the wind, though the air was calm. Still, it made me uneasy. I decided to stoke the fire a bit higher before night came fully. I gathered a few more sticks and fed them into the flames. When the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I sat closer to the fire, sipping from my water bottle, listening to the crackle. Every so often, I thought I heard something faint over the sound of the creek, like light footfalls, slow and deliberate, not the quick, random movements of an animal. They would stop whenever I moved or turned my head. By 9 p.m., I decided to go into the tent. I left the fire smoldering low. Inside, I zipped my sleeping bag up to my chin and lay listening. The creek gurgled steadily, but after maybe 20 minutes, I heard something else. Dry leaves crunching. Not many, just a few steps. They came from the side of the tent where my head was. They stopped, then started again, this time farther off, like whoever or whatever was out there was circling. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a fox, but the steps were too slow for an animal. They had weight to them, the kind of sound boots make on dry ground. I lay still, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Eventually, the noise faded. I must have drifted off after that, though my sleep was shallow. Sometime in the night, I woke again. The air inside the tent felt colder, and the fire outside had gone out completely. The moon was bright, casting pale light through the thin nylon walls. I lay there staring upward when I heard it again. Steps. But this time, they were closer. They stopped just outside the tent, maybe 2 feet from where my head was. I didn't move. I barely breathed. There was no talking, no obvious sound of breathing from outside, just that horrible stillness. Then I heard the faint crunch again. One step, slow and careful, like someone was testing the ground. I felt the smallest shift in the earth beneath me, as if a bit of weight had settled nearby. I gripped the handle of my flashlight inside my sleeping bag, ready to flick it on, but I didn't. My brain felt split between two thoughts. One saying it was nothing, the other screaming that I wasn't alone. After what felt like several minutes, the noise moved away. I lay there for a long time before falling back asleep. When I woke, the sun was just breaking through the trees. My first instinct was to check the ground around the tent. The pine needles were disturbed in places, but that didn't mean much. Animals did that all the time. Still, I could see a faint indentation in the dirt, like part of a footprint. Not enough to be certain, but it looked human. I tried to shake it off. I boiled some water for coffee and ate a granola bar. The day was calm, though I felt a knot in my stomach I couldn't get rid of. I debated hiking back out, but told myself I was being paranoid. I'd come here for solitude, and that's what I was getting. Around midday, I wandered down the creek for a bit, just to explore. I found an old fire pit about half a mile from my camp. The stones were blackened, and there were fragments of burnt wood inside, but it looked like no one had used it in months. Something about seeing it unsettled me, like someone else had been here before for the same reason as me, only they hadn't stayed. That night, I made sure to keep the fire bigger. I sat close, staring into the flames. Every so often, I glanced into the trees, but everything looked still. The noise didn't start until later, when I was already in my tent. At first, it was faint, a rustle here, a crunch there. Then it became more distinct. Footsteps again, slow, steady. This time, they didn't stop when I moved. They came closer, circling the tent. I could hear the pine needles shifting under each step. I sat up, gripping my flashlight and knife. My pulse pounded in my throat. The steps stopped behind me, maybe a yard away. I turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the thin tent wall, and saw the faint outline of a figure. Human height, still as stone. I froze. My mind went blank. The shadow didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then it slowly shifted, turning away, and the sound of footsteps faded into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, waiting for morning. As soon as the sun rose, I packed everything as fast as I could. When I started back toward the trail, I kept glancing behind me. Several times, I thought I saw movement far off, just a flicker of dark between the trees. My pace quickened. By the time I reached my car, my shirt was damp with sweat despite the cool air. I loaded my gear in, slammed the door, and locked it. Before I started the engine, I looked once more toward the trailhead. There was nothing there, just trees and shadow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there the whole time, watching. Not a ghost, not some story to scare people, just a person, and that was somehow worse. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was the middle of August, hot during the day but cooling off nicely at night, the kind of weather that made sleeping in a tent bearable. I had taken a week off work to finally spend some time out in the woods, far away from the noise of cars, phones, and people. My plan was simple: 3 nights alone in the forest, a small lake nearby for fishing, and enough supplies to last me without having to leave my campsite. I had camped alone before, but never this deep in. I parked my car at the trailhead just after sunrise and started hiking in. The trail was narrow and uneven, barely used. It twisted between tall pines and thick undergrowth, the air smelling of dry needles and warm soil. My backpack was heavy: tent, sleeping bag, fishing gear, food, water, and a small first aid kit. I carried a hunting knife on my belt and had a can of bear spray clipped to my pack. After about 4 miles, I found the spot I had scouted on the map weeks earlier. It was a flat clearing about 20 yards from the edge of the lake, far enough from the water to avoid the worst of the bugs, but close enough to drag in my fishing gear without trouble. The lake itself was small, maybe a couple hundred yards across, surrounded by trees on all sides. No cabins, no other campsites, no trails leading directly to it. Felt like my own little world. I dropped my pack, took a long drink from my water bottle, and stood there listening. It was quiet, just the sound of water lapping at the shore and the occasional bird. No distant traffic, no engines, no voices. Exactly what I wanted. I spent the rest of the morning setting up. I pitched my tent under a stand of birch trees where the ground was soft and shaded. I gathered some dead wood for the fire pit I planned to use later. I set up a small folding chair near the lake where I could fish in the afternoon. Everything was calm, normal. By mid-afternoon, I had caught 2 small trout, cleaned them, and packed them in a cooler with some ice packs I'd carried in. The sun was still high, so I decided to explore a little. I walked along the shoreline, following the curve of the lake. The trees here grew thick right up to the water's edge, and the ground was uneven with rocks and roots. At one point, I spotted what looked like old footprints in the mud boots, not bare feet. They were faint, dried at the edges, probably at least a day old. That gave me pause. I knew the area was public land, so technically anyone could be here, but the nearest trail was far enough away that I hadn't expected to see signs of other people. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe someone had fished here yesterday and moved on. By evening, I had a small fire going and the trout cooking on a flat rock near the flames. The smell of the fish mixed with the wood smoke, and I felt that familiar contentment of being out in the wild. The sun sank behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the clearing. That's when I first noticed it. Something faint, almost too quiet to be sure I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere in the woods behind my tent. I froze, listening. The sound didn't come again. Probably just a squirrel or raccoon. Animals moved constantly in the forest, and my mind knew that. But my body still tensed a little. As darkness fell, I doused the fire to a low burn, cleaned up the cooking area, and zipped myself into the tent. The air was cool, the nylon walls of the tent shifting slightly with the breeze off the lake. I lay there, staring at the thin ceiling above me, listening to the small noises of the forest. At some point in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The moonlight through the tent fabric made everything dimly visible, and the air was still. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not the light scurry of an animal, but the slow, deliberate crunch of weight on dry leaves. They were close, maybe 30 feet away. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved slowly around the clearing, stopping now and then continuing. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, wasn't trying to hide. After a minute or two, the sound faded toward the trees, and eventually it was gone. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound had me straining to hear more. By morning, I felt groggy, but part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe the footsteps had seemed human because of how slowly they moved. I made coffee over the fire and tried to shake off the unease. The second day went by without incident. I fished, explored further into the trees, and even found an old, half-collapsed wooden structure. Probably some hunter's blind from years ago. That night, though, it happened again. This time I was awake when I heard it. Slow footsteps in the underbrush. They moved from one side of the clearing to the other, keeping just far enough back that I couldn't see anything through the tent fabric. No flashlight, no talking, no engine in the distance. Just the steady crunch of movement. I sat up, my hand on the handle of my knife, listening as my pulse thudded in my ears. The sound stopped for a long time, then started again, moving away into the forest. The third day, I seriously considered packing up. I told myself I might just be spooking myself, but the rational part of me kept coming back to one thing. People don't just wander around the forest at night without a light unless they're trying not to be seen. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my bear spray and knife right next to my sleeping bag. Before bed, I banked the fire low and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds around me. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, the footsteps were closer. They circled halfway around the tent, then stopped. I could hear my own breathing inside the tent, slow and shaky. Then, just barely, I caught the sound of breathing outside. not an animal's short, quick huffs. Long, slow breaths, almost matching mine. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Eventually, the breathing stopped, and the steps faded away into the woods. By dawn, my decision was made. I packed everything quickly, my eyes constantly flicking to the tree line. I left the campsite as fast as I could hike with my gear, not stopping until I reached the trailhead. When I finally reached my car, I loaded everything in and locked the doors before starting the engine. Only when I was halfway down the road did I let myself really breathe. I never found out who or what had been out there those nights, but I know this: footsteps like that don't belong to deer, raccoons, or bears, and people who walk around campsites at night without light aren't doing it by accident. I haven't camped alone since. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The plan was simple: a few days away from everything, far from the noise, the routines, the screens, and the people. I wanted complete quiet, the kind you only get in the middle of nowhere. The area I chose wasn't one of those popular campgrounds where you can hear someone else's radio from 2 tents over. This was the kind of place you had to drive into for hours on dirt roads, the kind where you didn't see another person unless you went looking for them. I had studied the maps, checked the weather, and packed more than I thought I'd need. The truck was loaded with a tent, a sleeping bag, a small propane stove, food, water, a first aid kit, and a few other essentials. I had also brought my old but reliable flashlight, a backup headlamp, and spare batteries. My plan was to park in a small clearing near a trailhead I had read about, hike a couple of miles down into a valley, and set up camp near the edge of a small stream. From the satellite images, the spot looked perfect: shaded, flat, and far enough from the water to avoid problems if it rained. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. The last stretch of road was rough, with loose gravel and deep ruts, but the truck made it through. The air was cooler here, a mix of pine, damp soil, and the faint smell of distant rain. The forest stretched in every direction, thick with dark green and the occasional streak of sunlight breaking through gaps in the trees. I parked, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. No engines, no voices, not even the distant hum of traffic. Only the faint rush of wind through the trees. I strapped on my backpack, locked the truck, and started down the trail. The hike wasn't difficult, but it felt longer than I expected. The ground was damp from rain earlier in the week, and in places, my boots sank slightly into the mud. Small insects hovered in the air, catching the light. I kept a steady pace, stopping once to take a sip from my water bottle and check my bearings. The trail was narrow but clear, and it wound through clusters of tall pines before finally leveling out near the stream I had seen on the map. It was as perfect as I'd hoped. The water moved slowly, making a soft sound as it passed over smooth stones. The ground was firm, with only a thin layer of leaves and pine needles. I picked a spot about 20 yards from the water, between 2 sturdy trees that would help block some of the wind. I dropped my pack, took a deep breath, and started setting up camp. The tent went up easily, its dull green fabric blending into the forest. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and laid out my gear so I could find everything later without fumbling in the dark. After collecting some dry wood and kindling, I built a small fire ring with stones from the edge of the stream. The fire lit quickly, the orange flames adding a little warmth to the cool air. I heated up a simple meal on the stove, pasta with a packet of sauce, and ate while the light faded from the sky. By the time I cleaned up, the forest was deep in shadow. The stream became a dark ribbon, the sound of water louder in the quiet. I sat by the fire for a while, staring at the flames, until the cold began to creep into my fingers. I decided to turn in early. The first night passed without trouble, though I woke a few times to the sounds of the forest. A branch snapping somewhere, the distant rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just small animals moving around, which it probably was. The second day was calm. I spent most of it exploring along the stream, following it upstream where it narrowed and curved between steep banks. The ground there was softer and I found fresh tracks, deer maybe or something similar. I didn't think much of it. I collected more wood, checked my gear, and made sure my food was stored securely. That night, things felt different. I couldn't say why exactly, but as soon as the sun went down, the forest seemed heavier, as if the darkness itself had weight. The sounds were sharper, the water, the wind, and something else I couldn't quite place. I told myself I was just more alert because I was alone. Still, I kept the fire burning longer than usual before crawling into the tent. It was well past midnight when I woke up again. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Then I heard it. A faint sound of movement, slow and deliberate. Not the quick, random rustling of a small animal, but a careful shifting through leaves and undergrowth. It was coming from somewhere behind the tent, just beyond where the firelight had reached earlier. My pulse picked up instantly. I stayed still, straining to hear. The steps came again, not many, but enough to know someone or something was out there. I reached slowly for my flashlight, careful not to make noise. The zipper on the tent seemed impossibly loud as I opened it just enough to slip outside. The cold hit me immediately, but I ignored it, scanning the trees with the beam of light. Nothing. I turned slowly, checking the ground, the trunks, the edge of the stream. My breath came in quick bursts, visible in the beam. I didn't hear the steps anymore. After a long minute, I backed toward the tent, still shining the light into the dark. I got back inside, zipped the door, and sat there with the flashlight in my lap, listening. The silence stretched on, until eventually exhaustion pulled me back down. The next morning, I went to check the area where I thought the sound had come from. The ground was damp, and sure enough, I found impressions in the soil. Not clear enough to identify exactly, but definitely larger than any deer track I'd seen. The strides seemed longer, too. I tried to convince myself it could have been a hiker passing through, but this far out, that seemed unlikely. That day, I didn't wander as far from camp. I kept the fire going most of the afternoon, adding more wood than I needed, just to feel safer. I noticed myself glancing over my shoulder more often, scanning the trees for movement. That night, the steps came again. This time they were closer, and I could hear the faint crunch of leaves under weight. I stayed in the tent, gripping the flashlight and my small hatchet. The sound stopped, then started again from a different direction, circling. I felt every muscle in my body tense. It went on for what felt like an hour before fading away into the distance. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to cut the trip short and head back to the truck. I packed quickly, keeping my head on a swivel. The forest seemed normal again in daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The hike back was slower. The trail felt different now, narrower, the trees taller and closer together. Halfway up, I found fresh prints in the mud, overlapping my own from the day I arrived. They were bigger than my boots and headed in the same direction I had come from. I didn't stop again until I reached the truck. The relief I felt when I unlocked the door was almost overwhelming. I tossed my gear inside, started the engine, and began the long drive back. For hours afterward, even on the main road, I kept checking the mirrors. I never saw anyone, but I still don't camp alone anymore. I had been planning the camping trip for a few weeks, telling myself it would be good to spend some time away from everything. My job had been eating up every ounce of my patience, and I needed something to pull me out of the noise of everyday life. I picked a location I had never been to before, a small patch of forest land about 4 hours away from where I lived. It wasn't part of any big national park, just a section of woods with a few public trails, no official campsites, and barely any people around. The kind of place where you could set up a tent and not see another person for days. That was exactly what I wanted. The day I left, the sky was clear and the air warm, the kind of summer day where you can roll the windows down and just let the wind wash over you. I had packed the usual gear: a 2-person tent, sleeping bag, a couple of tarps, cooking supplies, plenty of food and water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, an extra set of batteries, and a small folding knife I usually kept clipped to my belt. My backpack was heavy, but I had carried worse. I parked my car in a gravel turnout where the trailhead started, then slung the pack over my shoulders and started walking. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, winding through tall grass and low shrubs before dipping into the thicker part of the woods. Once I was about a mile in, the world already felt quieter. The distant sound of traffic was gone. All I could hear were the dry leaves shifting in the breeze and the occasional bird overhead. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees became. I passed a couple of spots that looked like they'd work for camping, but I wanted to go farther in, find a place where even the trail didn't seem well used. After about 2 hours of steady walking, I found it. The trail bent sharply and ran along a shallow slope, and just off to the side was a small clearing where the ground was level. There was enough open space to set up my tent, but it was surrounded by trees thick enough to block most of the wind. A fallen log sat along the far edge, half covered in moss, and the ground underfoot was soft with years of pine needles. It was exactly the kind of spot I'd been picturing in my head. I dropped my pack and started setting up camp. The tent went up easily, the tarps laid out over the ground where I planned to cook and store my supplies. I gathered some dry sticks and a few thicker logs for a small fire later, then boiled some water for instant noodles. By the time I finished eating, the sun was sinking lower between the trees, painting the clearing in orange light. I sat on the fallen log and just listened. No engines, no voices, no phone buzzing in my pocket. Just the quiet. Night came on quickly. The forest around me shifted into a darker world, one where shapes were harder to make out and every small sound carried farther. I lit the fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat close to it. Every so often I'd hear something move in the trees, a squirrel maybe, or a branch snapping in the wind, but it all felt normal. I stayed up for another hour, feeding the fire until it was just glowing embers, then crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. Took a while to fall asleep. The ground was uneven in places, and the forest didn't go completely silent. There were small rustles now and then, a faint thud somewhere deeper in the woods. But exhaustion won, and eventually I drifted off. I woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. It was faint but sharp, something like a dry twig breaking, but closer to my tent than I was comfortable with. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I lay still, listening. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then another snap. This time it was followed by a soft crunch of leaves, deliberate and spaced out. My heart rate picked up. I reached slowly for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag but didn't turn it on. I strained to hear, trying to figure out the direction the sound was coming from. It seemed to circle the clearing, not in a rush, just moving at a steady pace. The steps would stop for several seconds, then start again. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even a raccoon, but the weight of the steps seemed heavier, and they weren't quick or nervous like an animal's. They were careful, measured. After what felt like minutes, the sound stopped completely. I stayed awake for a long time, listening to nothing, the silence somehow more unnerving than the footsteps had been. Eventually, my body gave in and I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning sunlight came through the tent walls, and I unzipped the flap slowly, scanning the clearing. Everything looked the same at first glance. My pack was still where I left it, my cooking gear untouched. But then I saw the ground. There were marks in the dirt just beyond the edge of the clearing. Not boot prints exactly, but depressions in the soil spaced like someone walking. They led in from the trees, stopped about 20 feet from my tent, then curved around and disappeared back into the woods. The pine needles had softened the edges, but they hadn't been there yesterday. I told myself again it could have been an animal. The rational part of my brain wanted to believe that. I boiled water for coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and tried to shake it off. I'd come out here for peace and quiet, not to spook myself into packing up early. Still, the feeling stayed with me. I decided to stick closer to camp that day instead of hiking deeper. I gathered more firewood, refilled my water bottles from a nearby stream, and made sure my camp was in order. Every now and then I'd glance toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather, and the air felt heavier. I cooked an early dinner, figuring I'd get some sleep before the rain started. As the light faded, I banked the fire low and zipped myself into the tent. Sometime in the night, I woke again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the distinct sound of fabric brushing against something, like clothing catching on a branch. I lay still, my breathing shallow, my ears tuned to every noise outside. Then came the slow crunch of leaves. Closer this time, the steps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and loud. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for several seconds, not moving. And then, without warning, there was the faintest scrape against the side of the tent wall. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to be away from the noise of the city, away from the glowing screens and endless movement. Just me, my gear, and the forest. It was early autumn, the air already cooler at night, but still warm enough in the day to make hiking comfortable. I had chosen a place deep in the mountains, several miles from the nearest trailhead. The map showed a river winding through a wide valley, surrounded by dense forest and steep ridges. I figured I could set up camp near the water and spend a few days there. The hike took most of the afternoon. My backpack felt heavier than I'd expected, and the trail was steeper than the topo lines on the map had led me to believe. Every step seemed to have a layer of loose pine needles or damp leaves that made the footing just slick enough to keep me careful. The sound of the river grew louder as I got closer, until I could see it through the trees. A broad, fast-moving current with dark water and white froth in the middle. It wasn't the kind of river you could wade across easily. I picked a spot to camp a little uphill from the bank, far enough to avoid any flooding but close enough that I could fetch water easily. The ground was mostly level, covered in pine needles, with a fallen log I could use as a bench. I pitched my tent facing the river, the opening giving me a clear view down the slope. The sun was dipping low, and the air was taking on that damp evening chill that settles in the moment the light fades. Once the tent was up, I built a small fire pit with a ring of stones I found nearby. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove and sat for a while, listening to the forest. It was alive with the usual evening sounds, distant bird calls, the faint hum of insects, the rush of water below. I didn't hear anything larger moving in the underbrush, which gave me some comfort. I had read enough about bears and mountain lions to know that keeping a clean camp was important. After eating, I sealed the food into a bear canister and walked it a good 50 yards away from the tent, tucking it between two boulders. Night came quickly. The trees around me turned to dark silhouettes against a dim navy sky. I lay in the tent with my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, the fire now just aglow outside. The river's constant noise was like static in my ears, a steady background that made everything else seem far away. I dozed off faster than I expected. It must have been close to midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had stirred me. The tent was cold, and I could see my breath in the narrow beam of moonlight coming through the mesh. I lay still, trying to listen. The river was still there, rushing steadily, but there was another sound layered over it. Faint, rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. They were slow, spaced apart, and heavy enough that I could hear the weight pressing into the ground. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe an elk, but there was something about the timing of the steps. They weren't quick or jittery the way prey animals usually moved. This was slower, more careful, as if whatever it was didn't want to be heard. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then I heard something else. A low huff like an exhale through a broad set of nostrils. My stomach tightened. That wasn't a deer. That wasn't even close. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, my ears straining for the next sound. Then I heard the crunch of leaves again, closer now, moving toward the tent from the direction of the river. I didn't move my head, but my eyes darted to where my flashlight was, next to my sleeping bag. I thought about grabbing it, but a strange instinct told me not to make any noise. The steps kept coming, slow and steady, until they stopped again just outside the tent. I could hear the breathing now, heavier, almost a low rumble deep in its chest. I didn't need to see it to know it was big. My mind was already flipping through the animals in this region. Black bear, most likely. maybe a large male. For what felt like a full minute, nothing happened. Just the sound of its breathing and the faint rustle of its weight shifting on the ground. I didn't dare move. I knew that black bears weren't naturally aggressive toward humans unless they were startled or saw an easy opportunity for food. My bear canister was far from here, but I started wondering if maybe I had left some scent inside the tent without realizing. The breathing shifted slightly, and then I heard a deep, wet sniff along the fabric wall of the tent. It was right there, inches away from my head. I could hear it pulling in the air, testing the smell of me, the tent, everything. My muscles felt like stone. It moved slowly toward the front of the tent, still sniffing. I could hear its claws softly scuffing the dirt. At one point, I thought it might push on the tent fabric, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed just in front of the door for a few moments before I heard another deep huff and the sound of it moving away. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay there listening until the footsteps faded into the distance, then lay awake in the cold dark for hours. Every small sound seemed louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. By morning, the forest felt calmer. The light filtered down through the trees, and the river looked almost peaceful again. I got out of the tent and walked a slow circle around my campsite. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the soft dirt, big and distinct, with the front pad wide and the toes tipped with claw marks. Bear, no doubt. The prints led from the riverbank right up to the tent, then back toward the tree line. I told myself it was just curiosity, that the bear had moved on. Still, I decided I'd pack up and hike deeper into the valley, maybe find a spot farther from the water where animals wouldn't pass by so easily. I broke down camp, stuffed everything into my pack, and started following a faint game trail uphill. The climb was steep, and I could feel the weight of the pack dragging on my shoulders. The trees closed in overhead, blocking some of the light. I went about 2 miles before finding another clearing, smaller than the first but with a good view of the ridge above. I set the tent again, this time without a fire, and ate a cold meal. I kept the bear canister even farther from the tent this time. That night, I lay in the dark with my knife inside the sleeping bag, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if a bear actually came through. I drifted in and out of light sleep until a sound woke me, the sharp crack of a branch somewhere behind the tent. My chest tightened instantly. It wasn't far away. Another crack followed, and then I heard the slow tread again, the same heavy rhythm as before. I'll keep going with exactly this level of detail and realism until the clear, final ending, but it's going to be very long. This will easily pass 5,000 words. Do you want me to continue straight through the rest of the story in one go without stopping? It started with the idea of getting away from everything for a few days. No work, no noise, no people, just me, a tent, and the woods. I had been feeling worn out from the routine of my life, so I packed up my gear one Friday morning and drove out to a state forest I had visited once before, years ago. This time, I planned to hike farther in past where most casual campers set up. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough. The air was warm but not too hot, the late summer sun bright overhead. The dirt road into the forest was rough, full of loose gravel and small potholes, but my old truck handled it well enough. When I reached the small parking area, there were only 2 other cars. That was a good sign. It meant not many people were out here. I pulled my backpack out of the truck bed, adjusted the straps, and started my hike in. The trail was narrow, lined with tall trees whose branches swayed lightly in the breeze. Every now and then, I'd hear the sharp crack of a twig somewhere deeper in the woods, but it was probably just squirrels or birds. I tried to keep a steady pace, but my pack was heavy with food, water, sleeping gear, and a small propane stove. The forest floor was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the smell of the woods was strong, earthy, damp, and faintly sweet from decaying plants. After a few hours, I came to a small clearing that looked perfect. It wasn't too open, so it would be sheltered from the wind, but it had enough space for my tent and a little fire pit. A thin stream ran just beyond the trees on the far side, and the sound of the water was faint but steady. I set my pack down and stretched my shoulders before getting to work. I put up the tent first, making sure the stakes were tight in the ground. Then I gathered some dry sticks and small branches for a fire. By the time I had everything set up, the sun was lower and the shadows between the trees were getting longer. I boiled some water on the stove for instant noodles, ate slowly, and let myself relax. This was exactly what I came for. No voices, no cars, no screens. Just the woods, the wind, and me. When it got fully dark, the forest seemed to change. The air cooled quickly, and every sound felt sharper. I heard the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl, the faint splash of something moving in the stream. I kept the fire small, just enough for light and a little heat. Eventually, I crawled into the tent, zipped the door shut, and lay back in my sleeping bag. The first night was peaceful. I woke up once or twice to shift around, but there was nothing unusual. In the morning, the forest was bright and full of bird calls. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and spent the day exploring a few trails that branched off from my campsite. I saw deer tracks, a few raccoons in the distance, and a hawk circling high above. It all felt calm, safe. The second night was different. It was around midnight when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I was lying still, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, when I realized the woods were quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. The kind of silence that makes your skin feel tight. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it. A slow, heavy step. Not the light, quick sound of a deer or raccoon. This was something bigger. Each footfall made the leaves crunch and the ground faintly thud. It wasn't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. I could hear it moving in a slow arc, circling. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My mind tried to guess. Bear? Wild boar? The steps were careful, deliberate, not crashing through the brush but placing weight slowly, like it was aware of making noise. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The sound moved closer. I could hear the faint huff of breath, deep and heavy. Something brushed against a low branch, and the leaves rustled. I gripped the handle of the small hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. For a few minutes, the footsteps moved around me, then stopped. I waited, my muscles aching from tension. After a while, the forest stayed silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. That's when I saw them. Tracks. Large, wide paw prints in the soft earth, the claws visible at the tips. A bear. The prints circled the tent, then led off toward the stream. My stomach tightened. I'd read about black bears in the area, but I'd never been this close to one. I decided to be more careful. I cleaned up my camp, packed all food into a bear-proof canister, and moved it well away from my tent. I kept the fire going most of the day, hoping the smoke and scent would keep anything from getting too curious. That night, it came back. I heard it even earlier this time, before midnight. The same slow steps, the same deep breaths. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, holding the hatchet, my ears straining. The footsteps moved closer, and I heard the sound of it sniffing the air. It was right outside. Something heavy brushed the side of the tent. The thin fabric pressed inward slightly, then released. I could hear the wet sound of its nose, breathing in. My hand was shaking on the hatchet handle. I thought about making noise, but something in me froze. I just stayed still, hoping it would lose interest. It lingered longer this time, maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Finally, I heard it moving away. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I made a decision. I would leave a day early. I didn't want to spend another night wondering if it would try to push into the tent. I started packing, but as I did, I noticed something in the soft dirt near the stream. A half-eaten fish, fresh. It wasn't there the day before. The bear had been fishing nearby, probably using the stream as a regular food source. My camp was too close to its territory. I slung my pack on my shoulders and started back toward the trailhead. The sun was bright, and the forest seemed calm again, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The tracks appeared along the trail in some spots, as if it had walked the same path. About halfway out, I heard movement behind me. Heavy, steady steps. I didn't turn at first, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks. But the sound grew clearer. I turned my head just enough to see a shape between the trees, moving parallel to me. Black fur. My mouth went dry. I picked up my pace, not running but walking fast. My pack bounced against my back, and the straps dug into my shoulders. The bear kept pace, always just far enough back that I couldn't see it clearly. But I knew it was there. The last mile felt endless. My legs burned, and sweat ran down my back. Every time I looked, I caught glimpses of dark movement in the trees. When I finally saw the parking area through the branches, I didn't stop moving. I reached the truck, threw my pack into the bed, and climbed inside. As I started the engine, I looked back toward the trail. The trees were still, but I felt certain it was there, watching. I drove away without stopping. That night, at home, I could still hear the slow, heavy steps in my head. I knew I'd camp again someday, but not there. Not where the bear had walked circles around my tent in the dark, breathing in the scent of me while I lay still, pretending I wasn't there. It was late summer when I decided to take a trip out to the woods. I had been needing a break from work for a long time, and I figured a few nights out in nature would clear my head. I packed my gear carefully the night before: tent, sleeping bag, cooking stove, enough food for 4 days, and a first aid kit. The weather forecast showed nothing but mild days and cool nights. I also packed something extra: my dog, Duke. Duke was a 2-year-old German Shepherd, strong, alert, and trained well enough to listen to every command I gave him. He was my companion on hikes, my running partner in the mornings, and the kind of dog who didn't need a leash unless we were somewhere crowded. I trusted him completely, and I liked having him with me when I was out in the woods because he noticed things I didn't. His ears picked up sounds I couldn't hear. His nose caught scents I wouldn't have noticed, and if something was wrong, I'd know by watching him. The spot I had picked was a little over a mile off one of the lesser-used trails in the state park. I'd been there before, and I liked it because it was far enough from the main paths that you rarely saw anyone else. The nearest ranger station was about 6 miles away, and the thick trees made it feel like I was completely alone. The first day went perfectly. I set up camp in a small clearing where the ground was level and the trees were tall enough to give shade but not block the breeze. The smell of pine mixed with the faint sweetness of wildflowers from a patch nearby. Duke explored the perimeter, tail up, ears moving constantly as he sniffed everything. When I set up the tent, he came back and sat nearby, watching me like a sentry. That night was quiet except for the usual sounds: crickets, the distant call of an owl, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the brush. Duke slept lightly, opening his eyes whenever something made a noise, then relaxing again when he decided it was nothing. The next day, I decided to take Duke for a long hike deeper into the forest. We followed a narrow path that wound up a ridge, where we could see over the tops of the trees for miles. The air was cooler there, and I could smell the dampness of a nearby stream. We came back to camp in the late afternoon, tired but content. I cooked a simple dinner on the camp stove, and we ate as the sun went down. That night, though, things felt different. It was subtle at first. Duke kept lifting his head, sniffing the air, then looking off into the trees. His ears stayed forward more than usual. I figured it might be a deer or maybe even a fox. I told myself not to worry. Still, I noticed he didn't fully relax that night. His breathing stayed slow and careful, and every so often, he would stand up, turn in a circle, and lie back down facing a different direction. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of him growling softly. It wasn't loud, just a low vibration from his chest, but it was enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. I lay still, listening. The forest was silent. No crickets, no owl, nothing. That was what bothered me most. I didn't hear anything unusual. I heard nothing at all. Duke stood up and moved to the tent door, nose pressed against the fabric. His body was rigid. I reached for my flashlight, trying to keep my movements quiet. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The beam of light caught nothing but trees and shadows. My eyes scanned the clearing, my ears straining for any sound. Still nothing. Eventually, Duke eased down, though he stayed alert. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 feet from the tent, in the soft dirt near the clearing's edge, there were tracks. They weren't boot prints or paw prints I recognized. They were bigger than a coyote's, but not quite like a dog's. The toes were spread wider, and the nails dug in deep. I crouched down, feeling the dampness of the soil. Whatever had made those prints had been there recently, maybe even while we were asleep. I decided to stay in camp that day, keeping Duke close. He seemed restless, pacing the clearing's edge, stopping to sniff the air over and over. At one point, he stood still for almost 2 minutes, staring in the same direction. His body was tense, tail stiff, ears forward. I followed his gaze but saw only trees and undergrowth. By evening, the tension in the air felt heavier. I ate quickly, fed Duke, and made sure everything was packed in tight. I kept my flashlight close, along with the small hatchet I had brought. That night, I woke again, this time to the sound of movement outside the tent. Slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. Not the quick scurry of a rabbit or the light tread of a raccoon. These were heavier, spaced evenly apart. Duke was already up, his body pressed forward, teeth slightly bared. His breathing was short and fast. I could hear it moving, circling the clearing. Every few steps, it stopped, and I could almost feel the weight of something out there watching us. My grip tightened on the flashlight. I waited until the sound was on the far side of the camp before unzipping the tent just enough to shine the beam. For a split second, I saw movement, something low to the ground, moving quickly into the brush. My heart pounded and I kept the light there, but it was gone. Duke stayed tense, growling softly, until the sound faded into the distance. Morning brought no relief. The tracks were back. More of them this time and closer to the tent. Some of the dirt looked disturbed, as if something had pawed at it. Duke sniffed the tracks, hackles raised, tail stiff. He followed them to the tree line but stopped there, looking back at me. I made a decision then. I wasn't going to wait another night. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees, and we started the hike back toward the main trail. The woods felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. We had been walking for maybe an hour when Duke suddenly froze, ears forward. A moment later, I heard it too, a branch snapping somewhere behind us. Then another. The sound was closer than I liked. I quickened my pace, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, sweat starting to run down my back. Every few minutes, I looked over my shoulder, and every time, I caught nothing but trees. But the sounds didn't stop. Sometimes they were to the left, sometimes to the right, always just far enough away that I couldn't see the source. Duke stayed close to my side, muscles tense, glancing back often. Finally, we reached the main trail. The forest was still thick here, but I knew we were only a couple of miles from the parking lot. I felt a little safer, but I didn't slow down. The sounds behind us followed for another half-mile before fading. When we reached the lot, I put my gear in the car and let Duke jump in. As I started the engine, I realized my hands were shaking. I looked back toward the trailhead one last time. The woods were still, quiet, almost calm again. We drove away, and I didn't go back to that spot for a long time. Whatever had been out there wasn't curious, it was persistent. I still don't know exactly what it was. Maybe a big stray dog, maybe something wild and hungry. But I know one thing. Without Duke, I might not have had the warning I needed to get out in time. And that's why I've never camped out there again. It was late September when I decided to head out for a 3-day camping trip on my own. The weather had been cooling down, the air crisp in the mornings but still warm enough in the afternoons to be comfortable. I wanted solitude more than anything. I'd been working long hours and dealing with too many people for too long, and I wanted to be far from everyone. No phones, no traffic, no constant background noise. Just trees, dirt, and the sound of water somewhere nearby. I picked a spot in a national forest I'd been to a few times before, but not this deep into it. Usually, I stayed closer to the main trails where other hikers and campers would occasionally pass by. This time, I parked my truck on the side of an unmarked dirt road and followed a narrow game trail for almost 3 miles before I found the place I wanted. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick brush, with a shallow creek running about 20 yards downhill. The ground was mostly flat, covered with a mix of dry leaves, pine needles, and patches of dirt. It felt isolated. I dropped my pack and stood there for a few minutes, just listening. No engines, no voices, no hum of distant roads. I could hear the faint rush of water over rocks from the creek and the occasional creak of tree trunks shifting in the breeze. A jay squawked somewhere above me, and I caught a flicker of blue between the branches. I set up my tent on the flattest patch of ground, using the extra tarp I'd brought as a ground sheet. It took less than 10 minutes, and then I arranged my small folding chair near the fire ring I built from a few scattered rocks. I gathered enough deadfall for the evening, stacking it neatly to the side. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth, the kind of smell that sinks deep into your clothes. By the time I boiled water for a simple meal, the sun was dipping lower, spilling orange light through the tree trunks. The shadows stretched across the clearing, and the air grew cooler. I sat there with the steam from my cup rising into my face, watching the colors fade. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire until the wood was almost gone, listening to the soft crackle and the occasional rustle in the brush. Forest animals moving about never bothered me. I'd camped enough to know what deer, raccoons, and squirrels sound like. Their movements are usually quick, random, and fade away fast. That night, I heard them only faintly before crawling into my sleeping bag and falling asleep. The second day, I decided to follow the creek downstream. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and my folding knife and set off. The banks were muddy in spots, with the occasional fallen tree lying across the water. I saw tracks, mostly deer, maybe a raccoon or two. At one point, I found a section where the water was deep and slow, reflecting the trees perfectly. It was the kind of place you could sit for hours without realizing time had passed. When I turned back, it was already mid-afternoon. I noticed something on the far bank, a set of deeper footprints, not boots but bare feet. They were long and narrow, and the toes were spread like someone had walked without shoes for years. They were pressed into the damp mud in a line leading into the trees. The size made me think of an adult male, but I couldn't figure out why anyone would be walking barefoot this far out. The nearest small town was over 15 miles away, and this wasn't exactly the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. I stood there a while, just staring at them. They didn't look fresh, maybe a day or two old, but they were clear enough to see each toe. I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. People did strange things in the woods all the time. I crossed back over to my side and kept going. That night, I built another fire as the light faded. The wind had picked up slightly, rattling the branches overhead. I ate in silence, staring into the flames, thinking about the footprints. Every so often, I would glance toward the trees beyond the firelight, half expecting to see something there. Nothing moved except the shadows of swaying branches. I stayed up later than usual, feeding the fire until I had only a few small logs left. I didn't like the idea of going to sleep with my mind turning over the thought of someone else out here, walking barefoot, watching maybe. When I finally got into my tent, I left my folding knife in the side pocket of my sleeping bag. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire outside had burned down to nothing but faint embers, so the clearing was almost completely dark. I lay still, listening. The wind had died down, and the air was so still I could hear the creek clearly. Then I caught it, something moving. It wasn't the quick, light scurry of a raccoon or the heavy bound of a deer. It was slower, deliberate, footsteps on dry leaves, one after the other, pacing. The sound came from somewhere behind my tent, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time off to my left. They weren't in a hurry, and they weren't random. It sounded like whoever or whatever it was circling. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, until the sound faded toward the trees. My chest was tight, my heart thudding. I told myself not to unzip the tent, not to look. If it was an animal, I didn't want to spook it. If it was a person, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I don't know how long I lay there before sleep finally pulled me under again. The next morning, I stepped out into the clearing and scanned the ground. There were marks in the leaf litter where something had moved through, but nothing clear enough to identify. I checked the area behind the tent and found faint impressions. Long, narrow shapes, almost like the footprints I'd seen by the creek. They weren't deep, just enough to disturb the leaves. My stomach felt heavy as I made coffee. I kept telling myself it was just some drifter or maybe a hiker taking a weird route through the forest. But why circle my camp in the middle of the night? Why not just pass through? I decided to cut my trip short. I spent the morning breaking down camp, packing everything as quickly as I could without leaving anything behind. The air felt different, heavier, like it was pressing against me. Every sound in the trees made me tense. By noon, I had my pack on and was heading back up the game trail toward my truck. The forest felt quiet, but not in the peaceful way it had when I'd arrived. Now it felt like it was watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the spaces between the trees. Couple miles in, I heard something behind me. Not close, but faint. Dry leaves crunching underfoot. I stopped, listening. The sound stopped too. I waited, then started walking again. A few minutes later, it came back, matching my pace. I didn't want to run, but my legs were starting to shake. I gripped the straps of my pack and forced myself to keep moving at a steady pace. The trail narrowed between two thick clusters of brush, and as I passed through, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shape, low to the ground, slipping behind a tree, too fast to see clearly. My breathing quickened. I wanted to turn and look, but I kept moving. The dirt road was close now, half a mile at most. When I finally broke out of the trees and saw my truck sitting there, I almost laughed from relief. I didn't even take my pack off. I tossed it into the bed, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I turned onto the road, I glanced back once. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows. But I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I was miles away, until the forest was just a dark line in the distance. Even now, I don't know what it was. I only know that someone or something followed me out of those woods, and I will never go back. I had been planning the camping trip for months. I wanted something remote, somewhere far from any crowds, where I could just listen to the wind move through the trees and feel like I had the whole forest to myself. I had gone camping plenty of times before, but usually at established campgrounds. This time, I wanted something different, true solitude. I'd read about an area deep in the state forest that wasn't on the main camping maps. There were no marked campsites, no amenities, just a mix of pine and hardwood forest intersected by a few overgrown trails that didn't get much foot traffic. It was supposed to be peaceful and wild, the kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another person. That's what drew me to it. I packed light but thorough. A small two-person tent, a down sleeping bag, a thin inflatable pad, enough food for 3 days, a water filter pump, a small camp stove, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a headlamp with spare batteries. My knife, a fire starter, and a lightweight hatchet went in the outer pocket of my pack. I also had a paper map of the area folded up in a Ziploc bag and a compass. The weather forecast was clear, cool nights, warm days, so I figured I wouldn't have to deal with rain. I drove out early on a Friday morning, taking the highway most of the way and then a long stretch of rural road lined with farmhouses and old barns before turning onto a dirt forest road. The trees closed in on both sides, sunlight cutting through in strips. Every now and then, a deer would dart across the road ahead of me. I drove slowly, partly to avoid hitting wildlife and partly because the road was so rutted it felt like my car's suspension was being tested. After about 45 minutes, the road narrowed even more and eventually dead-ended in a small clearing with just enough room to park. There was no sign or trail marker, just a faint path leading into the trees. I locked the car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The air was cooler under the canopy. The trail was narrow, barely more than a game path, with low branches that occasionally scraped against my arms. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles and damp leaves. I could hear nothing but my own footfalls, the occasional bird call, and the wind stirring the treetops. It took about 2 hours of steady walking before I found a spot that felt right. It was a small flat area near a shallow creek, ringed with tall pines and thick undergrowth. There was enough open space to pitch the tent, and the creek meant I wouldn't have to hike far for water. The ground was soft but not marshy. I set my pack down and took a slow look around. Everything was still. I pitched the tent, staked it down tight, and laid out my sleeping bag and pad inside. The air smelled like pine sap and damp soil. I could hear the creek gurgling over rocks just beyond the trees. After setting up camp, I filtered a couple of liters of water from the creek, then ate a quick lunch of trail mix and jerky. The rest of the afternoon I spent exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, noting landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. At one point, I found a fallen tree with claw marks on the trunk, probably from a black bear climbing for food at some point. The marks didn't look fresh, but it still made me alert. I decided to keep my food sealed in odor-proof bags and hang it at night, just in case. By early evening, the light was starting to fade, so I headed back to camp. I gathered some deadfall for a small fire, not so much for warmth, since it wasn't too cold yet, but for cooking and a bit of comfort. As the sun dropped behind the trees, I boiled water for a dehydrated meal and sat by the fire, eating slowly while the forest around me darkened. When night came, it came quickly. Without the fire, I wouldn't have seen much beyond a few feet. The forest sounds changed. Birds quieted down, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional distant rustle in the undergrowth. Every now and then I thought I heard movement farther off, a slow shifting of leaves, but I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. I went to bed early, crawling into my sleeping bag and turning off my headlamp. I lay there in the dark, listening. I could hear the creek faintly and the wind brushing through the high branches. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound that didn't fit. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the quick, light steps of a deer. Not the erratic scurrying of a raccoon. This was heavier, slower, almost careful. I held still, my eyes open in the dark. The steps moved closer, then stopped. I strained my ears, holding my breath. Nothing. Then another crunch, and another. The sound stopped again, this time closer than before. I could feel my pulse in my neck. I reached for my knife, keeping it in my sleeping bag with me. The steps didn't come any closer. After a few minutes of stillness, I heard them moving away, fading into the forest. I barely slept after that. Every little noise jolted me awake. By the time the first light seeped through the tent fabric, I was already packing up my food bag from where I had hung it in a tree. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks that I could see, no disturbed gear, but the sound had been real. I knew I hadn't imagined it. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I gathered more firewood, filtered more water, and kept my eyes scanning the trees. Around midday, I decided to hike a short loop along the creek, making sure I stayed within an easy walk back. At one point, I saw a flash of movement on the opposite bank. Dark fur moving through the brush, but it was gone before I could make out any details. Back at camp, I ate dinner before the sun went down. I built the fire up a little more that night, the glow pushing back the darkness a few more feet. As I sat there, I kept hearing faint snaps and rustles just at the edge of the firelight. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to keep me on edge. When I finally turned in, I kept my knife and headlamp within reach. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. The forest noises blended together after a while, and I must have drifted off until the sound came again. The same slow, careful crunching, this time closer than before. I could hear breathing, faint but steady, just beyond the thin tent wall. Not animal panting, but deep, controlled breaths. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing myself. My mind was racing. Bear? Person? Then I heard it. A faint metallic click, like something brushing against metal. My first thought was my cooking pot hanging from the food line, but that was a good 20 feet from the tent. Whatever it was right next to me. I gripped the knife harder, my palms damp. The breathing stayed for what felt like minutes, then slowly moved away. I waited, counting in my head to 60, then another 60 before I even moved. The rest of the night was silent, but I didn't sleep. By morning, my decision was made. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I packed my gear quickly, not even stopping for breakfast. When I went to take down my food bag, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The rope had been cut, clean, not frayed like an animal chewing through it. The bag was still there, but the knot was gone, replaced by a rough loop. Someone had been in my camp. I didn't waste time thinking about it then. I just got moving. The hike back felt longer than before, every sound in the trees making me turn my head. A couple of times I thought I saw movement behind me, but whenever I stopped to look, there was nothing. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, far down the trail, I saw a figure standing still. Too far to see details, just the outline of a person motionless, watching. I didn't wait to see if they moved. I drove, the dirt road rattling under my tires, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that part of the forest. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was something I'd been telling myself I needed. A weekend away from noise, away from the city, away from screens. I picked a location about 4 hours from where I lived, somewhere in the northern hills where the woods stretched for miles and the trails didn't see much foot traffic. The idea was simple. Hike in with my gear, set up camp by the lake, fish a little, maybe take some photos and just breathe for a change. I didn't want crowds, didn't want music blaring from someone's Bluetooth speaker, didn't want kids running around. I wanted quiet, and I got exactly that, but not in the way I had imagined. The drive itself was easy. The road wound between tall pines, their tops shifting slightly in the wind, the late afternoon sun cutting sharp lines of light across the asphalt. I stopped at a small general store before turning onto the dirt access road, picking up an extra pack of water bottles and a snack I didn't need. There was no cell signal once I left the main road, which honestly made me feel good. No notifications, no pings, just the sound of my tires crunching over gravel as I pushed further into the woods. The access road narrowed to a single lane, and eventually, I parked in a small dirt clearing where the trail began. The air was cooler here with a faint dampness to it, the smell of pine needles heavy in the air. I loaded my backpack, double-checked that I had my tent, food, knife, first aid kit, and flashlight, and then started walking. The trail was overgrown in some parts, though still clear enough to follow. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. You had to know it was here. I hiked for about an hour before reaching the spot I had picked out from the map. A small rise overlooking the lake, with a flat patch just big enough for my tent. The water was still, reflecting the surrounding trees, and there wasn't a single ripple except for when the wind brushed over the surface. The silence was deep. I set up my tent, staked it down, and gathered a few pieces of fallen wood for a small fire. There was no rush. The sun was still high enough that the air held some warmth. My plan was simple. Get everything ready before it got dark so I wouldn't be fumbling with gear by flashlight. Once the tent was up, I cooked a quick meal over my small camping stove, ate, and cleaned my utensils. I knew better than to leave food scraps lying around. This was bear country, and even if I didn't see one, I wasn't about to tempt fate. By the time the sun began to set, I had a small fire going. The light faded slowly, the orange sky sinking into purple and then black. I sat by the fire, listening to the small cracks and pops of the burning wood, my eyes drifting toward the lake every so often. The reflection of the moon was clear in the water, and for a while, I felt that deep, satisfying stillness I had been craving. It wasn't until I heard the first sound that I felt the edge of unease. It was faint, something like a quick, dry snap, a twig breaking. First, I thought it was nothing. A squirrel, maybe a deer. The woods are full of small sounds, and when you're out there alone, you hear them more clearly than you do in any park or backyard. I told myself not to overthink it, but a few minutes later, there was another one. Closer. I turned off my headlamp and sat still. When you're alone in the woods, darkness presses in differently. It feels heavier. The fire was still glowing, casting a faint circle of light, but beyond that, the trees were just silhouettes. I strained my ears, trying to separate normal forest sounds from anything that didn't belong. For a while, there was nothing. Then, I heard it again, a deliberate crunch of leaves, slow, careful. My first thought was bear, which sent my stomach tightening instantly. I kept my flashlight in my hand and tried to stay calm. Bears generally avoided humans, but not always. I didn't see anything when I pointed the beam toward the tree line. Just trunks, branches, and shadows. I kept the light there for a moment, scanning slowly, then brought it back down. Still, the sense of being watched stayed with me. I threw a couple more pieces of wood on the fire, telling myself that animals didn't like firelight. I sat for another hour, but the tension didn't leave. Every small sound felt closer than it should have been. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept my flashlight close and zipped the fabric shut tightly. The inside of the tent felt safer, even though I knew it wasn't really protection. I lay there for a long time, listening to the quiet. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. Something moving outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Not heavy enough to be a bear, not light enough to be a squirrel. Something walking. The sound circled halfway around the tent before stopping. I lay completely still, every muscle tense. Then I heard a soft scrape, like a shoe sliding on dirt. That's when I knew this wasn't an animal. I waited, barely breathing, my hand wrapped tightly around the flashlight. After what felt like minutes, the sound moved again, fading toward the woods. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone crouching just outside, waiting. When the first light came through the tent fabric, I got up immediately. The air was damp, the fire long dead. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. There were faint depressions in the dirt, not deep enough to see a clear tread, but definitely footprints. Human. They came from the direction of the trees and stopped within a few feet of my tent before turning back. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was another camper, though I hadn't seen anyone on the trail. Maybe someone just passing through. But why stop at my tent in the middle of the night? I decided to keep my guard up. I made breakfast, but my appetite was gone. My plan had been to stay 2 nights, but now I wasn't sure. Still, I told myself not to let paranoia ruin the trip. I spent the morning fishing at the lake, keeping my gear close. The sun warmed the air, and for a while it almost felt normal again. But around midday, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Across the lake, barely visible between the trees, there was movement. A figure, too far away to see clearly, but I could tell it was a person, standing still, facing the water. I froze, my fishing rod in my hands. They didn't move, not for a long time. I pretended not to notice, acting like I was just focusing on the water. But every so often, I glanced up, and they were still there, watching. When I finally turned fully to look again, they were gone. The rest of the day, I felt the same eyes on me. I didn't see the person again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind ran through possibilities: hunter, hiker, someone lost. But none of them explained why they wouldn't just walk over or call out. That night, I didn't light a fire. I figured less light meant less attention. I ate a cold meal in the tent and sat in the dark, listening. The woods were quieter than the night before. Too quiet. It started again sometime after midnight. Soft footsteps moving slowly. This time, they came closer, pausing every few steps. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The sound stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady. I gripped my flashlight and knife, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to unzip the tent and make myself vulnerable, but every instinct told me I needed to do something. Before I could, the sound moved again around the tent to the backside. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, shaking. When the sun rose, I stepped outside and saw fresh prints in the dirt again. This time they were clearer, definitely a shoe tread, not boots, not bare feet. That was it for me. I packed up as fast as I could, barely eating. The trail felt different now, narrower, more enclosed. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following. Halfway back to the car, I stopped dead. On the side of the trail, there was a small piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark blue, like from a jacket or shirt. It looked fresh. I didn't take it. I didn't want anything that belonged to whoever was out there. I just walked faster, my legs burning, my shoulders aching under the weight of my pack. When I finally reached the car, I tossed my gear in and slammed the door. I didn't even stop to take off my boots before starting the engine. The dirt road back to the highway felt like it stretched forever. Every turn of the trees felt like it could hide someone. When I finally reached pavement, I didn't slow down until I was miles away. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. I never saw their face, never heard a voice. But I know this. Someone was out there, moving in the dark, watching me, and they were close enough to touch my tent. I haven't been back to that lake since. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was to spend 3 nights alone in the woods, far from any marked trail, somewhere quiet where I could clear my head. I had been feeling stuck in my routine lately, and camping had always been the one thing that helped me reset. I picked a national forest about 4 hours from home, an area I had never explored before. From the maps I studied, there were thick patches of pine and spruce, rolling hills, and small creeks that cut through the valleys. There were also stretches of old logging roads, most of them abandoned, which meant I could hike in without bumping into other people. I didn't want to see anyone out there. The morning I left, the air was warm but overcast. I packed everything the night before. My tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 4 days, a small axe, water filter, extra clothes, and my old hunting knife that had been with me for years. I checked my pack twice to make sure nothing was missing. I also brought a first aid kit and a small flashlight with extra batteries. By noon, I had reached the forest. I parked my car on the side of a gravel road that hadn't seen much traffic, judging by the grass growing between the tire ruts. From there, I slung my pack over my shoulders and started hiking in. At first, the path was easy, wide enough for a vehicle, the ground hard and flat. But after about 40 minutes, I turned off onto a faint trail that cut deeper into the trees. The canopy thickened quickly, swallowing the sound of the wind, and I felt that shift in the air that happens when you're far from any sign of human life. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing just big enough for my tent. It sat next to a narrow stream, the water running clear over smooth stones. The ground was mostly level, covered in pine needles, and there were no big ant hills or exposed roots. I set my pack down and stood there for a while, just listening. All I heard was the water and the occasional creak of trees. No cars, no voices, exactly what I wanted. I pitched the tent and laid out my sleeping bag inside. I collected dead branches and small sticks from the ground and built a fire pit with a ring of rocks I found nearby. By the time the fire was going, the light had begun to fade into that pale, grayish blue that comes before night. I made a simple dinner, boiled pasta with a packet of tuna, and ate while sitting on a log. I remember feeling content, even a little proud of myself for finding such a peaceful spot. That first night, I slept well. The air cooled down, and the steady sound of the stream was like white noise. I woke up once or twice, hearing small rustles in the underbrush, but I told myself it was just squirrels or raccoons. The next day, I decided to explore farther up the stream. I left my pack behind, carrying only a water bottle and my knife. The stream wound through thickets and fallen logs, forcing me to hop over rocks and push through low branches. After maybe an hour, I noticed a faint smell, something sharp and unpleasant, carried by the breeze. I thought it might be a dead animal somewhere nearby. As I moved closer, the smell grew stronger. Then I saw it. A deer carcass lying half in the water, its ribcage torn open. The flesh picked clean in some places but still ragged in others. Flies swarmed thick around it. The kill didn't look old. The blood in the water was still faintly red. My first thought was coyotes, but the tearing looked rougher, and the legs were twisted in a way that didn't seem like the work of smaller animals. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, before deciding to head back to camp. On the way, I kept glancing behind me. The forest felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. Every crack of a branch made my shoulders tense. When I reached camp, I added more wood to the fire and sat close to it, telling myself I was being paranoid. Still, I kept my knife within reach all afternoon. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving in the brush on the far side of the stream. It was slow, deliberate, not the quick, light scurrying of a raccoon. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The movement stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. The fire had burned down to embers, and I didn't want to unzip the tent and draw attention. I lay there for what felt like an hour, heart pounding, until eventually the sound faded away. In the morning, I found fresh tracks in the damp soil near the stream. They were larger than a dog's, with deep claw marks. I knew they were bear tracks, but something about them felt off. The stride seemed uneven, like whatever it was had been moving slowly, almost dragging its feet. I thought about packing up and leaving then, but the sun was out, and in daylight the fear felt foolish. I convinced myself I could handle it if I stayed alert. The third day was warm, and I decided to stay close to camp. I gathered more wood, filtered water, and kept the fire going brighter than usual. In the afternoon, I heard something from deeper in the woods. A low, rhythmic thud, like heavy steps, came and went, never close enough to see the source. By sunset, I was on edge again. I cooked quickly, ate, and made sure the fire was big enough to throw light into the surrounding trees. The forest was unusually quiet that night. No insects, no distant calls of owls. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, the sound was not across the stream. It was right outside my tent. I could hear slow breathing, deep and steady. Then something brushed against the fabric, making it ripple slightly. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tight my hand hurt. The thing outside stayed there for what felt like forever. I could hear faint shifting, the sound of weight moving on the ground. Then it circled the tent once, slow and deliberate. When it reached the side near my head, it stopped again. I thought about lunging out with the knife, but fear kept me still. Eventually, after a long silence, I heard the steps retreat into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could. I doused the fire, slung on my pack, and started back the way I'd come. My pace was quick, almost a jog, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt heavier, the air thicker. About halfway back, I saw movement ahead on the trail. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but then it stepped into clearer view and my stomach dropped. It was a black bear, big, its fur matted and patchy, one of its ears torn. It wasn't charging, but it wasn't moving away either. It just stood there, head low, eyes fixed on me. I slowly backed up, keeping my pack between us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After a long standoff, the bear finally turned and moved off into the trees, but I could still hear it moving parallel to the trail as I walked. It followed me for nearly half a mile, always just far enough away that I couldn't see it unless I stopped and listened. When I finally reached the gravel road, I didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I drove until I hit the main highway before I let myself breathe normally again. Even now, I don't know if the bear had been watching me from the first day, or if it just stumbled onto my camp by chance. But I know this: I won't be camping alone that deep in the woods again. Some places are peaceful until they decide you don't belong there. It had been months since I had taken any real time away from the noise of the city. My job kept me locked to screens and deadlines, and even when I was home, my head was still spinning from work. I decided I needed to be somewhere far away from all of it, somewhere without any reception, somewhere where the only sounds I would hear were wind through the trees and water moving over rocks. That's how I ended up planning a camping trip deep in the woods, far past the kind of campsites where families bring coolers and folding chairs. I wanted a place I could only get to by walking for hours with everything I needed strapped to my back. The week before I left, I spent every spare moment gathering supplies: lightweight tent, sleeping bag rated for cold nights, water filter pump, first aid kit, small cooking pot, camping stove, headlamp, extra batteries, bear spray, and a knife that felt heavier than it needed to be. I read trail reports from people who had been in that part of the forest recently. The path wasn't well marked and the terrain was rough, but if you kept the river on your left and moved north, you'd eventually hit a clearing big enough for a small camp. There was no cell service, and the nearest road was hours away. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early on a Friday morning, the sun just starting to rise. My pack felt heavier than I remembered during the test runs at home. The first few miles were easy enough, wide dirt paths that narrowed into more overgrown sections, with brambles that grabbed at my pants and branches that scraped my shoulders. I could hear the river off to my left almost the entire time. The air smelled clean, sharper than the city air, and I could feel the temperature drop as the trees thickened. By early afternoon, I was deeper into the forest than I had been in years. The path was gone entirely, replaced by uneven ground littered with fallen branches, moss-covered rocks, and roots that seemed determined to trip me. I found the clearing just before the sun started to dip. It was about the size of a small backyard, open enough for sunlight to reach the ground. A few old fire pits made from stones told me I wasn't the first to camp here, but there were no other signs of people, no trash, no footprints, no gear left behind. I set up my tent on the flattest patch of ground I could find and got a fire going while there was still light. The forest went quiet in a way that made me aware of every sound I made. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and let my muscles relax for the first time in hours. The sky turned dark quickly, the kind of deep black you only get far from towns. I sat by the fire until the wood burned down to glowing coals, then crawled into my tent and zipped it up. That first night, I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind shifted, it carried new sounds. Something moving through dry leaves, a branch snapping in the distance, the faint splash of water from the river. I reminded myself that it was normal. The forest is alive with animals, most of them small. Still, every noise felt close in the darkness. I kept my bear spray within reach and forced myself to rest. Morning came with a thin mist hanging over the clearing. My breath came out in small clouds as I made coffee over the stove. I decided to spend the day exploring upriver. The water was cold enough to sting my hands when I touched it, and the rocks were slick with moss. I saw tracks in the mud, deer, raccoon, something else I didn't recognize right away. A few hours into the hike, I spotted something odd between the trees. At first, I thought it was another fire pit, but as I got closer, I saw it was a crude wooden structure. 3 logs leaning together like a small tripod, with strips of cloth tied at the top. The cloth was dirty, stiff like it had been there a long time. Around it, the ground was cleared of leaves, as if someone had brushed them away recently. I stood there for a while, feeling the hair on my neck rise. It didn't make sense for that to be here. This wasn't a marked campsite, and I hadn't seen any signs of people all morning. I didn't touch it. I just turned back toward my camp, keeping the river in sight. That night, the forest didn't sound the same. The wind was gone, but every now and then, I'd hear something in the distance, slow, deliberate movements, not the quick scurrying of small animals. My fire burned longer than the night before. I didn't want to be in total darkness. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound just outside the tent. It was soft, like fabric brushing against something. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. The sound moved around my tent once, then stopped. I gripped the knife inside my sleeping bag and waited. Minutes passed before I heard it again, farther away this time, fading into the woods. When the sun came up, I stepped outside to check for tracks. The ground was disturbed in several spots, but the soil was too firm to hold a clear print. My pack was still where I'd left it. Nothing seemed missing, but the feeling stayed with me all day. Someone or something had been there. I thought about leaving, packing up and hiking back the way I came, but it was a long walk, and I told myself I might be overreacting. Maybe it was a deer, curious about the tent. I stayed another night, keeping the fire going as long as possible. This time, I heard the same slow movement in the distance, but it never came close. I barely slept. The next morning, I noticed something that made my decision for me. On a tree at the edge of the clearing, there was a piece of cloth tied to a branch, almost the same as the ones on that tripod structure I'd seen upriver. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I packed up fast, skipping breakfast. The forest felt heavier, the silence broken only by my own footsteps and the river. Every now and then, I'd think I heard something behind me, but when I stopped, it stopped too. I didn't turn around. It took me most of the day to get back to where the trail widened. By the time I reached my car, my legs were shaking. I loaded my gear, locked the doors, and didn't look back. I don't know who made that tripod, or why someone would come into my camp in the middle of the night. I only know that it wasn't an accident. Whoever they were, they wanted me to know they were there, and they knew exactly where I had been sleeping. I haven't been camping alone since. It was late summer when I decided to head out for a few days alone in the woods. I had been planning the trip for a while, wanting some time away from everything, no phone, no noise, no people. I chose a spot deep inside a state forest I had visited years ago. Back then, I had only been on the marked trails, but I remembered seeing faint paths branching off into the trees, places where you could disappear for miles. That's where I wanted to be this time, completely alone. I parked my car at a small gravel pull-off where the trail began, shouldered my heavy pack, and started walking. The air was warm and sticky, but the sky was clear and blue. I carried my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and some basic supplies, and moved steadily through the forest. As the official trail curved north, I turned off into one of the faint side paths I had remembered. The ground was uneven, and the air felt heavier here. The trees grew closer together, their branches weaving into each other overhead, letting in only slices of sunlight. For hours, I followed no real trail, just patches of ground that looked a little more walked on than others. Eventually, I found a small clearing just big enough for my tent, surrounded by dense brush. A fallen log lay on one side, moss covering its damp surface. The earth was soft here, almost spongy under my boots. It was far enough from any marked trail that I felt confident no one would wander through. That was what I wanted. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and stored my food in a sealed bag. The silence was different out here. There were sounds, rustling leaves, the occasional bird call, but no hum of distant traffic, no faint chatter of hikers. It was like the forest had its own rhythm, slow and steady, and I was now part of it. As the evening came, the air cooled, and the light shifted to a softer gold. I built a small fire in a circle of rocks I found nearby. The smell of the smoke blended with the damp scent of the ground and plants. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and listened. I didn't hear anything unusual, but there was a constant sense of being surrounded. The forest wasn't empty. I knew that there were animals everywhere. I tried to keep that in mind and not let my imagination start thinking about people. People were the ones who worried me more than animals. When night came, the forest turned black almost instantly. The canopy was too thick for moonlight to help much. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay there listening to the quiet. Every sound carried further at night. A snapping twig could be a raccoon 10 feet away or something bigger 100 yards off. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something small moving in the brush or the distant knock of a branch falling. The second day, I went exploring. I followed a dry creek bed deeper into the forest, keeping careful track of my direction so I wouldn't get lost. The further I went, the stranger the woods felt. There were more fallen trees, thick undergrowth, and fewer signs of deer or other animals. I found a rusted metal barrel half buried in the dirt, covered in old bullet holes. It looked like it had been there for decades. I couldn't imagine how it had gotten here. There were no roads nearby. Later, I found what looked like an old fire ring. Just a few blackened stones and ash, but long cold. It meant someone had camped here before. That in itself wasn't strange, but I felt something off about it. There were no signs of recent use, but the clearing around it felt unnatural, as if someone had cut or broken branches to open it up, then left it to grow wild again. I didn't linger long. By late afternoon, I was back at my camp. I had an odd, restless feeling, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation, the silence pressing in, but I couldn't shake it. That night, I built my fire earlier and ate while there was still daylight. As the sky darkened, I put the fire out completely and went inside my tent. I thought maybe not having the light would make me less visible to anyone or anything out there. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke to the sound of movement. It wasn't the small, quick scurry of a raccoon or squirrel. This was slower, heavier. The footsteps, if that's what they were, came from somewhere in the darkness beyond my tent. I lay perfectly still, my ears straining to pick out each sound. They would stop for long moments, then start again, circling at a distance. Could have been a deer, I told myself. But deer don't usually stop and stand for minutes at a time, listening. That's what it felt like. Like whatever it was listening for me. I didn't sleep after that. The noises faded eventually, but I stayed frozen, waiting for them to return. They never did, but by morning I was exhausted. The third day, I thought about leaving early, but part of me felt stubborn. I had planned this trip for months, and I didn't want to be scared out of it by nothing. Still, I stayed closer to camp, keeping my knife on my belt and glancing over my shoulder more than I'd like to admit. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. About 50 yards from my tent, in a patch of mud near the creek bed, there were footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't been in that exact spot before. They looked human. The edges were soft, like they had been there overnight. I counted 4 prints before they vanished into the undergrowth. They weren't boot prints either. They looked more like worn sneakers. The uneasy feeling that had been hovering over me solidified into something heavier. Someone had been out here close enough to find my camp if they wanted to. Maybe they already had. That night, I didn't make a fire. I sat inside my tent as the sun went down, listening. The forest was full of quiet noises, but I thought I heard movement again. Not as close as before, but there. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves. Hours passed like that, me lying still, ears tuned to every sound. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. This time it was closer. Slow steps, then a pause, then another. It stopped directly behind my tent. I could hear the faint crunch of the ground under weight. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. I gripped my knife and stayed silent. The sound didn't move for what felt like minutes. Then it slowly faded away into the trees. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, checking the tree line every few seconds. The forest felt wrong now, too still. I strapped on my pack and started back the way I had come, moving fast. About a mile from where I had camped, I saw something that froze me in place. On a low branch, hanging about eye level, was a piece of red cloth. It was tied in a knot, frayed at the edges, swaying slightly in the breeze. It hadn't been there when I came in. I didn't touch it. I just kept moving faster. When I finally reached the gravel pull-off, my car was the only one there. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I drove away, checking my mirrors over and over. I never saw who it was. I don't know if they were watching me for the whole trip or if they just stumbled across me. But the footprints, the sounds at night, the cloth, it all pointed to someone being out there with me. And whoever they were, they never made themselves known. The worst part wasn't what happened. The worst part was knowing that if they had wanted to, I might never have made it back.